Chapter 1129. 30 years ago, Lin Xianyuan, the war god of the war god realm, split Miracle City. For the neutral camp outside of Miracle City, this was no secret. This meant that the war god realm and the human emperor palace were completely independent of the space-time corridor. It meant that both the human sovereign and the war god had reached the peak of the camp's strength. It meant that the human race had another choice and path. It meant that everyone had a different understanding of many things. But not many people understood the aftermath of the war god's sword. 30 years had passed in reality. In Xianyuan Wuxiang's concept of time, it was about 40,000 years ago. In the concept of time synchronized with the space-time corridor, Xianyuan Wuxiang, who was awake most of the time, was equivalent to 50,000 to 60,000 years in the space-time corridor. If either the human sovereign or the war god had always been awake, then the time flow in the space-time corridor wouldn't be much different from the war god realm and the human emperor palace. In these tens of thousands of years, the space-time corridor, the human emperor palace, and the war god realm had been carrying out a top-secret plan of the highest degree since Miracle City had been split. In the space-time corridor, this plan was codenamed Return Plan. In the war god realm, this plan was codenamed Split Plan. In the human emperor palace, this plan was codenamed Copy Plan. They had different names, but the general goal of the three sides was basically the same. The division of Miracle City seemed very simple, but that level of power was almost at the peak level of the three major factions. The whole splitting operation was simple and complicated. First of all, His Majesty the Space-Time Cloister would instantly release all his defenses to protect the Miracle City. In an instant, a large number of universal constants in the entire galaxy would become normal. In this extremely short period of time, the physics and astronomy of the entire galaxy would be biased towards the direction of the universe as a whole. To a certain extent, there would be a deviation from the physics and astronomy of the Miracle City that had the universal constants modified. And the moment the universal constants of the Milky Way galaxy became the same as the whole universe, the war god would immediately appear at the key node. This was the node of fate. Everything from heaven and earth to the starry sky, as small as a fundamental particle, as large as a complete universe, had its own fate. In the Milky Way galaxy, Miracle City naturally had its own fate. What the war god needed to do was to grasp the fate of Miracle City in an extremely short period of time. He would directly make a move and completely destroy the entire Miracle City. The sword light from his attack was still lingering in the sky above Miracle City, connected to a large number of defenses in the space-time corridor. After tens of thousands of years, the two sides had completely merged. Therefore, on the night of the decisive battle in Beihai, when Xingtian used his authority to change the physical constants in a small range and shot an invincible realm expert of the sanctuary to death with one arrow, a tiny loophole appeared in this world with Xingtian as the center. Or rather, it was a bug in the real world. This kind of bug was not rare in general, but it was the first time in the field of martial arts. This was not a big deal because such a small loophole was almost negligible. Even if it appeared, it would be fixed in an instant. But the moment this bug appeared, in that second or even half a second, Ruthless, who was full of energy, grasped this loophole, and Li Tianlan, who was connected to Ruthless Will, also grasped this loophole. So Li Tianlan directly felt the sword qi left by Lin Xianyuan when he split Miracle City more than 30 years ago in real time. That sword was called Break of Reincarnation. That was the plausible sword that Li Tianlan simulated when facing Jiang Shangyu and Li Guangtu. All of this was beyond the expectations of all the forces. Of course, now it seemed that it was no longer important. What was important was the influence of War God after he split Space-Time Corridor. His Majesty of Space-Time Corridor. War God of War God Realm. Human Emperor of Human Palace. In today's human clan, they were almost the top 3 strongest combat forces of the human clan. And the split of Miracle City was also a tacit cooperation between the 3 of them. They carried out 3 different plans, but in fact they could be regarded as one. His Majesty of Space-Time Corridor let go of the protection of the Milky Way in Miracle City. And War God split Miracle City with his sword. To be exact, he split the fate of Miracle City and the entire Milky Way. Whether it was an individual human being or a massive celestial body, the so-called fate would be connected to itself. At the moment when War God's sword light split Milky Way and Miracle City, Human Emperor of Human Palace stood on the fate node of the universe and restarted reincarnation. Tier Reincarnation Protection. Everything happened at the same time. That was why the God of War had torn apart the Miracle City with a single sword strike. but the miracle city had returned to its original state under the reincarnation of the human sovereign. In reality, the miracle city had been truly severed. Amidst all sorts of contradictions, the Time Corridor's Princess Royal Feng Qinggu had deceived the will of the world in a short period of time. So an incomprehensible but objective space-time paradox appeared in the cooperation of the peak figures of the neutral camp. The world's will could not determine the state of Miracle City and lost its lock on Miracle City once again. The Miracle City of space-time corridor still existed. And the separated Miracle City began to belong to War God Realm and Human Palace. This formed two Miracle Cities and two Milky Way galaxies. The Milky Way galaxies existed objectively. As for the real Miracle City, everything was real. But the same Milky Way galaxy and the same real Miracle City appeared in two different parallel spaces the moment the world's will was deceived. If the world was a river, then after this cooperation, this surging river had two almost equal tributaries, and as the river surged, the two tributaries flowed farther and farther in their own direction. Therefore, in tens of thousands of meaningless years, with the Miracle City as the center, the fate of being separated continued, and finally formed a parallel universe that was completely different from the space-time corridor, but similar to the space-time corridor to a certain extent. This was a man-made parallel universe. Could be said to be the foundation of Human Palace and War God Realm. For tens of thousands of years, the parallel space continued to spread, and today the parallel universe had expanded to nearly 6 trillion light-years. And this territory was completely parallel to space-time corridor, which was the headquarters of War God Realm and Human Palace. Two completely real miracle cities would naturally produce people and items that lived in two different spaces. But at the moment when Miracle City was separated, their fates had a slight error, so they did not have the same experience. For example, Gu Xianyan in the past and Qin Wei Bai Dao. For example, Dongqing Huangtu in the past and Li Tianlan now. For example, the current Wang family of Beihai and the Wang family of Beihai in that story. For example, King Wei. They were the same person in different spaces, but in a sense, they were equivalent to one person, not even a different personality of one person. They only had a little difference in experience, but their general character and thinking were completely the same. Because they were the same person. This was the so-called return plan, division plan, or replication plan. The three majesties standing at the peak level of the human clan all hoped to turn Li Tianlan, Qin Wei Bai, King Wei and some others from 1 to 2 so that they could grow up in different spaces and merge at a certain node of fate. Whether it was Li Tianlan or Qin Wei Bai, they all had their own real brand which would not have any impact on them, but would greatly accelerate the process of their return. But this plan had just started when it met with an accident. First of all, in the space of War God Realm, Gu Xianyan did not appear beside Li Tianlan, but in Kunlun City. Second, Dongqing Huangtu and the Wang family of Beihai, because of the influence of the core of King Wei, set foot in the real world, the real supreme field of martial arts, and even vaguely touched the law of Sword Tao. From that moment on, things were almost irreversible. A large part of Li Tianlan or Dongqing Huangtu's real brand was with Qin Wei Bai or Gu Xianyan in that space and time. Their fates were completely connected. When Gu Xianyan's spiritual domain had not completely broken through and completed the transformation to accept too much information, Dongqing Huangtu went to the supreme domain first, and his real brand was not enough for him to have that kind of authority. So the fate was out of balance and completely out of control became the inevitable outcome. So in that space and time, Dongqing Huangtu died in the hands of Gu Xianyan. The death of Dongqing Huangtu caused Gu Xianyan's fate to be completely out of control. Her Highness, who was completely crazy at that time, retaliated against everyone including herself and the whole world. Holding King Wei, she herself was at the peak of the invincible realm. With the cooperation of King Wei, she was almost invincible in the world. Kunlun City was completely destroyed. All the superpowers in the Dark World were also completely destroyed. Wang Tianzong died. Finally, in Mount Dibing she faced Wang Xingxiao and Jiang Shangyu with King Wei and died with them. Gu Xianyan also died there. The fate of Dongqing Huangtu and Gu Xianyan was completely out of control. At this point, the duplication, division, and return plan could almost be said to have failed to some extent. And this was the responsibility of the War God Realm and the Human Emperor Palace. In the face of the wrath of the space-time corridor, the Human Emperor Palace and the War God Realm had to compensate the space-time corridor with a lot of resources. At the same time, the Human Emperor of the Human Emperor Palace once again restarted the reincarnation. The fate of Dongqing Huangtu and Gu Xianyan was fixed. The space-time corridor transferred the real imprints of the two people on the fate node. Simply put, the space-time corridor transferred the fate of the two people and the fate and real imprints of King Wei from the space and time of the War God realm to, in the space and time of the space-time corridor. Dongqing Huangtu's real imprint and Li Tianlan in this space and time smoothly merged. Because they were originally one person. But no one expected that the real imprint of Zhou Xian actually maintained a symbiotic state with the Qin Wei Bai in this space and time and did not choose to merge. This was not too big a problem. The only problem was that the Qin Wei Bai in this world suddenly became two. The real imprints on them existed at the same time and they formed a whole. So now the two Qin Wei Bai were completely different people on the surface, but in fact they were one person. The return plan continued under the attention of the space-time corridor. Until Xianyuan Wuxiang came to the Miracle City and landed on Mount Dibing, everything seemed to be extremely smooth. In fact, until now the return of Li Tianlan and Qin Wei Bai had been very smooth. But there was a problem with King Wei. The attention of the space-time corridor to King Wei was not low at all. The first divine weapon of the neutral camp, the cornerstone of the world, the left hand of the human emperor, the guardian of the human clan, and King Wei's identity was enough to make the space-time corridor attach great importance and concern to him. They would often observe the state of King Wei. What was certain was that King Wei had always been normal in the Miracle City of the space-time corridor. The space-time corridor could confirm that the core of King Wei was polluted after the transfer from the space and time of the other King Wei in the War God realm to this space and time. This kind of pollution was extremely hidden. If not for close observation, Xianyuan Wuxiang would not have found it so far. It was the War God realm and the human emperor palace again. In this series of plans, because of their short rise time and lack of foundation, they made too many mistakes. Xianyuan Wuxiang looked at Lin Shi silently and did not speak for a long time. Lin Shi admitted that this was their mistake. This kind of words from one prince to another meant that the War God realm and the human emperor palace had begun to negotiate with the space-time corridor on this issue. That is to say, the pollution of King Wei has something to do with Jiang Shangyu? Xianyuan Wuxiang was silent for a while and suddenly asked seriously. This is the only explanation, but there is not enough evidence. Lin Shi said quietly. He waved his hand and the transparent screen in front of him changed slightly. The conference room disappeared and so did the interrogation room. Only the figure in the black trench coat was left in the small reception room, standing quietly in the small space. He seemed to be in a daze, deep in thought. Your Majesty, you know very well that he is not the ancestor of the Wang family, but it can be said that he is the ancestor of the Wang family of Beihai and the first heavenly son of the Wang family of Beihai. Lin Shi said blandly. He has come all the way and now stands at the peak. The Wang family of Beihai is all his descendants. If his descendants show signs of pollution, he can detect something wrong through the fate node. But in fact, everyone in the Wang family of Beihai is very normal. After the split plan failed, we observed the fate nodes of His Majesty Li Tianlan Qin Wei Bai, and His Highness King Wei from beginning to end, and carefully analyzed Her Highness Qin Wei Bai's last battle on Mount Dibing. We had a detailed analysis and evaluation of the state of Her Highness and King Wei at that time, and also an accurate analysis of Wang Xingxiao and Jiang Shangyu's combat capability at that time. It was a comprehensive analysis of low-level authority, and we had many simulations. So we can almost be sure that in the battle on Mount Dibing with Her Highness Qin Wei Bai's state, if it had developed normally, King Wei would have exhausted all his energy, and Her Highness Qin Wei Bai would have died completely. This was the most normal ending. In such an ending, the possibility of Wang Xingxiao and Jiang Shangyu dying was less than 45%. Xianyuan Wuxiang frowned. Lin Shi was silent for a moment and then said, but the fact is completely different from the most normal development. In the end, King Wei still maintained a negligible energy. Although Her Highness Qin Wei Bai was seriously injured and dying, she did not die completely. This is also the main reason for today's situation. His Majesty restarted the reincarnation cycle. If Her Highness Qin Wei Bai died completely, her real imprint would be reborn in the current Qin Wei Bai, along with her memory and martial arts. There would not be a second highness who was exactly the same. Fusion is instinct. Xianyuan Wuxiang said calmly, it's also the rule. It's true. Lin Shi nodded. But we speculate that maybe from the moment the battle on Mount Dibing ended, Her Highness Qin Wei Bai and King Wei had been contaminated. The information we got from the time corridor shows that Her Highness Qin Weibai's real imprint is extremely special. This kind of special may have prevented the rule and instinct. To some extent, although the two highnesses now coexist in the same time and space, the split has been successful. We have successfully replicated another Her Highness Qin Weibai. Xianyuan Wuxiang was silent. How is Her Highness now? Lin Shi glanced at Xianyuan Wuxiang. Xianyuan Wuxiang knew that he was not talking about the current Qin Weibai, but the one who was sleeping in the Lin clan. It was no secret that he had gone to the miracle city belonging to the war god realm through Qin Weibai's consciousness. It's still very dangerous, but it's also very important. Her consciousness directly affects whether this one can succeed or not. But I didn't feel any contamination in the depths of Her Highness's consciousness. Ha! Lin Shi laughed. If the depths of Her Highness's consciousness are really like what you said in the report to the time corridor, like an eternal furnace, then what kind of contamination can stay in her consciousness for a long time? Purification is the inevitable result. Xianyuan Wuxiang nodded thoughtfully. He was not surprised that Lin Shi could see the report he submitted to the time corridor. This level of top-secret information was shared among the top levels of the entire neutral camp. When Her Highness successfully wakes up and when this one begins to return, the two highnesses will be one. They can merge at will or choose to be independent. The split plan or the duplication plan has been completely successful with Her Highness Qin Weibai, and the results have even exceeded expectations. There was no longer a question of who was dominant between the two highnesses, because they could fuse and split at any time. Their current state was equivalent to having the same thoughts as their own, and they were each other's avatars. When they completely returned and fused, their strength would almost certainly surpass what they were in the past. This is the biggest gain of this plan. You call this a gain? Xianyuan Wuxiang was expressionless. Qin Weibai could break through the past after her return, which was naturally something to be happy about. But this so-called gain was not proportional to the investment of the three sides. The separation of the Miracle City could be said to be one of the biggest moves in the history of the human clan. It was a miracle in the fate of the camp. The whole process had been prepared for countless years and a lot of manpower and resources were consumed. Almost all the top figures in the neutral camp had gone all out, and in the end, a relatively perfect situation was left to the three strongest. Then Xianyuan Wuxiang's father found the key node of the fate of the universe. Such a miracle was almost irreproducible. If time and space could be separated at will, the starry sky today would not be in such a state. Of course, the separation of the Miracle City was not to let Li Tianlan and the others return, but it would take a long time for other plans to work. And the plan they had high hopes for only received some pitiful returns. This decision might not be a mistake in the long run, but specifically at present, it could not be regarded as brilliant. Lin Shi paused, completely ignoring Xianyuan Wuxiang's doubts and continued, as for King Wei, he may have been contaminated in the battle on Mount Dibing. Jiang Shangyu and Wang Xingxiao had the ability to kill Her Highness at that time. After all, before them Wang Tianzong also made Her Highness pay a sufficient price. But in such a situation, Her Highness was seriously injured but did not die. The only explanation is that Jiang Shangyu did not do his best. After all, in the face of the enemy who killed his father, Wang Xingxiao could not have held back. Jiang Shangyu, Xianyuan Wuxiang narrowed his eyes, and a cold killing intent flashed in his eyes. Rebel, maybe. At that time Jiang Shangyu may have thought that he had done his best, but in fact until now we still do not know what the symbiosis with Jiang Shangyu was. If the contamination of King Wei did come from something in Jiang Shangyu, then now we can be sure that Jiang Shangyu has turned to the chaotic camp. After all, King Wei's past experience is destined that he will not be contaminated by order. Isn't it obvious? Xianyuan Wuxiang said blandly. If integration is an instinct under normal circumstances, it is understandable that there are two His Highnesses, but it is inexplicable that there are two Jiang Shangyu. Two Jiang Shangyu, Lin Shi murmured. Are you sure there are only two? Anything can happen in the chaotic camp because they have no rules. They can be incredibly powerful or as weak as ants. If they are affected by chaos, what are two Jiang Shangyu? To be honest, even if there are 200 Jiang Shangyus now, I will not be surprised. If the contamination of King Wei came from Jiang Shangyu. In that battle His Highness only used King Wei to stab Jiang Shangyu. At most, the blade of King Wei was stained with Jiang Shangyu's blood. Just the contact of blood could contaminate King Wei. How powerful is the thing in Jiang Shangyu's body? The most important thing is that it is still in Jiang Shangyu's body. Xianyuan Wuxiang's voice was extremely low. This will be a big problem. This is our mistake. Lin Shi's voice was calm. Xianyuan Wuxiang had nothing to say. In the face of chaos, not only the weak war god realm and the emperor palace, but also the time-honored time corridor had no good way to deal with it. Chaos had different names in different people's mouths. Some called it shadow, some called it chaos. But the most basic mode of the chaotic camp was chaos and distortion. The human clan and the lawful camp had fought for countless reincarnations. The time corridor was very familiar with the doomsday of the order camp and some other peak creatures such as demons. As a chaotic camp that could run parallel with the lawful camp, they naturally had many peak experts, but almost no one knew about the time corridor. Because of chaos. Chaos, distortion, weirdness without any rules. Perhaps the chaos faction great leader who was fighting the war god to the death just a second ago would suddenly die in the next second. Perhaps his power would scatter all over the place and be distributed evenly among all the creatures of the chaos faction. Perhaps it would appear on any random soul, allowing it to directly obtain power that could rival the war god. Or maybe the peak creature that could rival the enemy emperor would be in the proud starry sky a second ago. The next second it would forget everything and crawl on the ground like an ignorant ant. Every opponent of the chaotic camp could not be locked on. Because every chaotic creature could be so powerful that it made people desperate, but at the same time, every chaotic creature could be so weak that it made people speechless. No one could tell who the thing in Jiang Shangyu's body was and what state it was in now. That thing can't be in a good state. At least we can be sure that it is not in its peak state. It may be weak or weak. Xianyuan Wuxiang said in a low voice. We can confirm this. Lin Shi nodded. To His Majesty Li Tianlan, to Her Highness Qin Weibai and to King Wei. If that thing was in its peak state when King Wei was polluted, then King Wei would not be attracted by the instinct of fusion when he returned here. In the Battle of Mount Dibing, Her Highness Qin Weibai unconsciously forced Wuyo and Wuqing to merge. But such a fusion split again when he returned here. Wuyo merged with Wuyo in this space-time, while Wuqing exhausted his energy and slept at the bottom of Jiangzhe Lake. If that thing was in its peak state, it would have stopped all this. It might even have used King Wei to further pollute Her Highness Qin Weibai and His Majesty Li Tianlan. Fortunately, none of this happened. So, King Wei's body can be said to be complete and unpolluted now. Xianyuan Wuxiang said. More than complete. After all, King Wei has now merged with some murderous weapons that belong to this spacetime. That is also his body. Lin Shi said softly. Xianyuan Wuxiang nodded thoughtfully. King Wei seemed to have been to Beihai before, but he did not choose to merge with Wuyo. Maybe at that time he had already realized something, but his understanding was not clear. Princess Royal gave King Wei some memory fragments a few days ago. From the perspective of memory, King Wei has also set foot on the road of return. His memory is becoming clear little by little, and his understanding of himself seems to be starting to become clear. So in this case, Xianyuan Wuxiang looked at the virtual screen in front of him. The man in the black trench coat stood silently, looking particularly silent and lonely. What do you think he is looking for? He is looking for Jiang Shangyu. Lin Shi suddenly narrowed his eyes. Maybe. Xianyuan Wuxiang nodded. King Wei has been with His Majesty for the longest time. His loyalty to His Majesty has become something engraved in his instinct. From this point of view, the two of them have the same thinking. He can know what His Majesty is thinking now. Obviously, His Majesty also wants to find Jiang Shangyu. And King Wei has some understanding of Wuyo's current state before. Can be said to be intuition, instinct, or anything. Princess Royal gave King Wei some memory fragments, which also made his self-awareness more clear, and he can clearly realize that his core has been polluted. If there are enough memory fragments, he can even determine where he was polluted and then think of Jiang Shangyu. Lin Shi said. Xianyuan Wuxiang nodded and continued this topic. His Majesty wants to kill Jiang Shangyu, so does King Wei. Their thinking is synchronized again and their goal is the same. How can the pollution be removed? Either it takes a long time and a lot of resources to remove it bit by bit, or it can be forcibly merged to suppress the pollution, or it can be killed at the source of the pollution and the pollution will disappear. Obviously King Wei thinks so. The standard style of King Wei, just like the legend. Lin Shi laughed. He was unscrupulous and lawless. He was the most arrogant and indulgent top figure in the history of the neutral camp. He was the only one who was not a human emperor but dared to call himself a legend. The cornerstone of the world, the pillar of the human clan. This was King Wei. Lin Shi looked at the transparent screen in front of him in a trance. He looked at the shadow that was lowering its head and thinking and murmured, obviously he wants to erase the pollution and find himself better. Xianyuan Wuxiang seemed to think of something and said calmly, obviously with King Wei's current ability he hasn't found Jiang Shangyu, which means that his hiding place is a bit strange. What do you think? Lin Shi understood what Xianyuan Wuxiang meant. He hesitated and said slowly, help King Wei to complete his body completely? It's meaningful but not very meaningful. King Wei's body is now more complete than it was in the beginning. What limits his power is the real environment, the serious injury that he has yet to recover from and the missing core. You want to rob the murderous weapon? Don't you care if the world is in chaos? Lin Shi was silent for a while and then asked, then what do you mean? Wuyo can't merge now. We have to know how serious the pollution is. But we can merge Wuyo and Wuqing and King Wei will become more complete. Wuyo is in the Lin clan and he belongs to your family. According to seniority you are the ancestor of the Lin clan. You can make this decision, right? Lin Shi narrowed his eyes and suddenly said, how can you be sure that Wuyo is not polluted? Huh, Xianyuan Wuxiang sneered. The other Wuyo is not here now, is he? He is still in the Miracle City in the realm of war. That doesn't mean anything. They are both the cores of King Wei. Although Wuyo is in a split state, the pollution can affect Wuyo. Don't worry, Wuyo can't be polluted. Neither the lawful camp nor the chaotic camp can pollute him. Xianyuan Wuxiang was silent for a while and then he said slowly. Lin Shi was slightly moved and then he said with a smile, I have some doubts. Xianyuan Wuxiang said, absent-mindedly. He already knew what Lin Shi wanted to ask. The apostles invaded the core databases of the Wang family of Beihai and the Lin clan, as well as the databases of various countries, including Zhongzhou state, and found a document called The Origin of Murderous Weapons. Lin Shi looked at Xianyuan Wuxiang's reaction seriously. The specific origin of King Wei is unclear in the document. It only says that King Wei is an extraterrestrial meteorite. That's not important. What's important is that King Wei was split and destroyed and he was made into 13 murderous weapons. His core was split into 2 and left in the Wang family of Beihai and the Lin clan respectively. Ninth Prince, don't you think it's strange? Xianyuan Wuxiang still didn't speak. Lin Shi's eyes flickered, and his double pupils opened and closed slightly, looking deep. With the technical level of Zhongzhou state at that time, it was a miracle to be able to split King Wei's body. Even if his body was split by chance and King Wei was seriously injured, it should be a whole with secret connections. But in fact, King Wei was in a split state now. His body became 13 murderous weapons, and the murderous weapons were connected to each other so their integration was very smooth. But carefree and ruthless, the body and the 2 cores are now independent of each other. Well, even if we can ignore the previous time and reluctantly explain that Carefree's independence was because of pollution, why is Carefree? Right now they were carefree, and emotionless, just like 3 independent individuals. With King Wei's level, how could he have fallen to such a state? Carefree was polluted but Carefree was not. It's also unreasonable. Isn't Carefree the energy core? Xianyuan Wuxiang took a deep breath and didn't speak. I can take Carefree and let it integrate with King Wei. But I need to know what's going on. Lin Shi said calmly. Xianyuan Wuxiang silently lit a cigarette, took a deep breath and then said slowly, in fact you're right. Lin Shi raised his eyebrows. King Wei's current body, the core and Carefree are independent, which has the most direct relationship with His Majesty's death. In the smoke, Xianyuan Wuxiang's voice was a little erratic. Carefree is not King Wei's energy core. There's only one real energy core and that's Carefree. Lin Shi's pupils suddenly shrank and he subconsciously lowered his voice. Then what is Carefree? Xianyuan Wuxiang hesitated and then slowly said, essentially, it's a divine image of His Majesty. That's a divine image of His Majesty. That's a divine image of His Majesty. That's a divine image of His Majesty. Lin Shi slowly straightened his body and silently looked at Xianyuan Wuxiang. Xianyuan Wuxiang lowered his head and said nothing. The hotel room suddenly fell silent. Oh. After a full 5 minutes, Lin Shi slowly nodded. You mean carefree is a divine image of His Majesty? Xianyuan Wushang nodded. Lin Shi took a deep breath and his expression was a little twisted, but then he became calm again. His voice also became a little polite. May I ask which divine image it is? Said to be a catastrophe, but who knows? Even His Majesty doesn't know now. Lin Shi nodded and then murmured again, that's a divine image of His Majesty. Xianyuan Wushang coughed a little awkwardly. Xianyuan Wushang. Lin Shi's erratic voice echoed in the room. Your Highness. He stared straight at Xianyuan Wushang and his voice suddenly condensed. His somewhat hollow voice also became a little angry. Damn fatty, I'll F***CKU. Chapter 1130. It was as if he had fallen into a deep pit and couldn't climb out. In Lin Shi's extremely long life, every time he had this feeling, it meant that he would have to pay a huge price even if he could survive. Worryless was one of His Majesty's divine forms. This was definitely a secret that only a few people in the space-time corridor knew. What did a divine form mean? It meant that it was one of the foundations of His Majesty's rise to the top. Although it was only one of the divine forms, although His Majesty hadn't returned, and although Lord Wei was seriously injured, it was not something they could resist. How dare the fat Xianyuan Wushang ask him to take Worryless? Was he doing that? Was he? Judging from the current state of Lord Wei's 3 separate parts, Lord Wei's body was still instinctively loyal. His soul or energy core had been contaminated to a certain extent, and the integration with Lord Wei's Real imprint came from the original His Majesty's figure, which was equivalent to having the original His Majesty and Lord Wei's common will. This kind of will might be very weak, but the instinct was always there. In this state, Worryless yearned for freedom the most. Therefore it was now independent and unwilling to integrate with Lord Wei's body. In this case, if he went to take Worryless, it meant that he would have to fight Worryless head-on. He would have to face the original His Majesty's divine form. Lin Shi's deep eyes looked as if they were about to spit fire. He stared at Xianyuan Wushang for nearly 5 minutes. Then he asked in confusion and disbelief, do we have a grudge? It was not as simple as a grudge. How much hatred did he have to have instigated him to take Worryless? No. Xianyuan Wushang said quietly. You and I have no grudge, so why did you instigate me to die? Lin Shi subconsciously clenched his fists. Don't get me wrong. Worryless' current state may not be as strong as you think. Xianyuan Wushang said indifferently, indeed, Wuru has merged with one of His Majesty's divine forms, but His Majesty has been dead for a long time and has yet to fully return. That divine form has long since dissipated, and it's now in a split state. Divine forms are related to one's self, so it is impossible for there to be 2 of them. Therefore, the specific state of the current divine form is that half of it is in this spacetime, and the other half is in the spacetime of the War God realm. That's why the current Worryless is only half a divine form. So you think I can subdue Wu Yu? Lin Shi smiled strangely. You really think highly of me? Not you, us. Xianyuan Wushang looked at Lin Shi. Think about it carefully. 2 saints, a calligrapher, an Azura, and an apostle. What does it mean? The spacetime corridor, the human emperor palace, the war god realm, and all the neutral factions combined, how many of such a lineup would they have? If we attack together, even if this half-divine form belongs to His Majesty, King Wei's condition is extremely poor. Do you think we can't succeed? The mockery on Lin Shi's face gradually disappeared and he fell into deep thought. He gave Xianyuan Wushang a deep look and repeated, we? Of course. Xianyuan Wushang said indifferently, I don't plan on sending you to your death. I'm talking about joining hands. After a pause, he laughed self-deprecatingly. Even if we really die, we'll do it together. Lin Shi continued to ponder. He added the apostles and the saints, together with Xianyuan Wushang and Xing Tian. Such a lineup, no matter what the occasion, could be considered an absolutely high-end and luxurious combination. Looking at the entire neutral faction, only a few of the top super armies would have such a lineup. This lineup referred to their strength. In fact, even those super armies couldn't be so extravagant as to have 2 saints. Azura, 2 saints, an apostle and a calligrapher. Facing half a divine form that was so weak that it was about to dissipate, and King Wei, who was suffering from this half-divine form, was not in good condition and was also seriously injured. This kind of situation it seemed could probably give it a try. Lin Shi seriously thought for a long time, then took a deep breath and said softly, "The apostles have been warned by Her Highness before. They had encountered Feng Qingwu as soon as they arrived at Miracle City. Feng Qingwu's warning was for the three of them." Her attention was focused on Lin Shi, but they all knew very well that Feng Qingwu's main target was the apostles. The neutral faction already had a clear idea of just how destructive an old apostle in perfect condition could be. It wasn't even the slightest exaggeration to say that in front of a true apostle Miracle City was even weaker than a piece of paper. It was just like sand. Xianyuan Wushang silently looked at Lin Shi as if he was looking at an idiot. "Her Highness is mainly afraid that you will destroy Miracle City out of impulse, right? That's part of the reason." Lin Shi smiled bitterly. "But I think it's also because of His Majesty. In short, in Miracle City, Her Highness doesn't allow saints to go all out." F***CK. You want to go all out in Miracle City? Go all out. Xianyuan Wushang let out a strange cry. The corner of Lin Shi's mouth twitched. "Don't you know what a saint is like in a real environment? His destructive power is indeed unquestionable, but with his current strength, how can he do anything to that half-divine form in a real environment? No, that's not a problem. In Miracle City, it's even difficult for us to lock onto him all the time." Xianyuan Wushang said quickly. "So?" Lin Shi glanced at Xianyuan Wushang. "The apostles have already mastered the space transfer technology, haven't they? Seal off an area, fold up that space and bring that space to a place far away from Miracle City. At that time we can do whatever we want. Her Royal Highness won't interfere. After all, she also wants to see King Wei gradually become complete." Xianyuan Wushang's tone was getting faster and faster. "And after King Wei has this half-divine form, his memory fragments will become clearer. If he can deal with Jiang Shangyu this time, we will save a lot of effort." Lin Shi pondered and finally nodded. Both King Wei and Li Tianlan's current state was extremely special. They had the real brand, but in the case that the real brand hadn't really awakened, they couldn't get access to authority for the time being. At most, they could only get some characteristics of authority. This made them look completely different from Lin Shi and Xianyuan Wushang. No one was sure what the state of the thing behind Jiang Shangyu that belonged to the chaotic camp was. But no matter what it was, if only King Wei and Li Tianlan took action, it wouldn't alarm him for the time being. If Jiang Shangyu could deal with it, Lin Shi would have solved a big problem. And this itself was a mistake of the War Immortal realm and the Human Emperor Palace. Lin Shi naturally hoped to make up for this mistake. To make up for it, the only thing he needed to do now was to face the seriously injured King Wei and the half-divine form that was about to dissipate. This was a risk, but it didn't seem too dangerous. He suddenly looked at Xianyuan Wushang and asked, "There's one thing I don't understand. If Wuyo is really a divine form of His Majesty and has merged with King Wei, then why was King Wei almost assimilated by the order at that time?" Because of his own imprint, the story of King Wei being assimilated by order was also circulated in the real world. For the current Zhongzhou state, it was a well-known legend that had been circulating for a long time. But when it came to King Wei and the corridor of time and space, it was a great humiliation. No one was perfect. Even if they were on the same level as the gods in the world, no one was perfect. Everyone in the corridor of time and space welcomed the return of the first His Majesty. Everyone was looking forward to Li Tianlan's growth. But the increasingly sparse memories and all kinds of vague signs showed that His Majesty, who had personally opened the neutral camp and laid the foundation of the human clan, was also a tyrant rarely seen throughout the ages, even though he was a saint of the human clan. Within the human clan, his contributions were undeniable, and he deserved everyone's respect and admiration. But his mistakes also couldn't be ignored. After His Majesty died, Great Emperor Xianyuan hadn't completely absorbed the power he left. During that time it was King Wei who propped up the backbone of the entire neutral camp. He was the cornerstone of the world and the pillar of the human clan. But almost being assimilated by the order was still a huge mistake for him. To some extent, under the shadow of the order, King Wei had caused a crack in the neutral camp that couldn't be repaired until now. That was exactly what Lin Shi was asking. If King Wei had accommodated a divine form of His Majesty, then as Xianyuan Wushang had said, with this divine form, King Wei couldn't be polluted by chaos or assimilated by order. As the founder of the neutral camp, if even a divine form of His Majesty could be polluted, It meant that the human clan had either become a chaotic shadow creature or an order creature that abided by absolute order. But none of this happened. How many terminations have you experienced? Xianyuan Wushang suddenly asked. Lin Shi subconsciously narrowed his eyes and said lightly, I haven't experienced it yet. I haven't, Xianyuan Wushang murmured to himself. His eyes were a little envious. So you can be called Lin Shi, the god of war can be called Lin Xianyuan, and the human emperor of the imperial palace is still Wang Fuxing. But there are some things that you should already be qualified to know. After the terminations, are you still Lin Shi? Lin Shi was stunned for a while and didn't speak. He couldn't answer this question. There were too many possibilities after the terminations. It was very likely that there would be no Lin Shi and everything would end. It was also possible that he would come back again. But at that time he would be Lin Shi but not completely Lin Shi. His father and his grandfather might become one person, or they might exist separately, but they would no longer be Lin Xianyuan and Wang Fuxing. After the terminations, the generations would gradually become chaotic, just like the relationship between the eldest princess and Xianyuan Wushang. They should be good friends, but now they couldn't tell whether Feng Qinggu was Xianyuan Wushang's sister or aunt. Everything would be distorted and memories would gradually deviate. Many things would be forgotten, buried, and completely disappeared. Some so-called truths had long since lost their answers. Just like Li Tianlan now. Everyone in the space-time corridor and the God of War's realm firmly believed that Li Tianlan was the original His Majesty's new identity after many terminations. The camp had already confirmed that His Majesty had died. However, he could no longer remember when and why His Majesty had fallen. Lin Shi frowned and said softly, "You mean you don't remember? There is very little information in this area, and the memories we left are relatively faint. We don't even know if it's true or not. According to our guess, King Wei should have been assimilated by the order not long after His Majesty died. Given King Wei's character, it's not difficult to guess what he would do. King Wei was already very strong at that time. The entire order camp seemed to have suffered heavy losses after the battle with His Majesty, so King Wei made them miserable. Under such circumstances, the number one expert of the order camp at that time barely sealed King Wei at the cost of a seriously injured arm, and then died not long after. No one could remember how long it had been since King Wei was sealed. In short, it was not like the legend in Zhou state. A long time had gradually eroded his will. When he was in a trance, a demon of the order camp simulated and replaced one or some of His Majesty's fate nodes. He transferred a small part of His Majesty's fate to another genius of the order camp at that time in a very short time. Xianyuan Wushang suddenly paused. Lin Shi listened attentively and subconsciously asked, "And then? Isn't it similar to the story in Zhou state? With the trance of fate, King Wei mistook someone else for someone else in his confusion. That genius of the order camp at that time only used some very small help to gain King Wei's trust, such as helping him remove the seal that actually couldn't last for long. With King Wei's level, he could quickly detect the abnormality in the other's fate. But it was too late." Lin Shi added softly. After a long silence, Xianyuan Wushang gnashed his teeth and said, "That bitch." Lin Shi was silent. The person he was talking about was no longer information. That person was now one of the strongest in the order camp. He had tampered with the fate of his student and temporarily linked His Majesty's fate with that of his student. After gaining King Wei's trust for a short time, he gave King Wei a gift. It was a poison covered in honey, a famous divine weapon in the order camp. That thing directly bound King Wei's soul. So even though his student was far from being a match for the seriously injured King Wei couldn't hurt him. He didn't even need to do anything. All he had to do was say a few words and King Wei's soul would be twisted in extreme pain, unable to resist. King Wei was assimilated into order. It was at that time that it officially began. He had no choice but to escort that student all the way to the neutral camp, through the star field of the chaotic camp, and finally returned to order. He watched as that student set foot on the peak. Lin Shi stood silently for a while and finally said, "No matter what, King Wei is finally back. You don't understand. Because you haven't experienced it." Xianyuan Wushang said in a low voice. At that time, King Wei escorted that bitch's student through the neutral camp and the chaotic camp. His Majesty had fallen and my father hadn't fully integrated with His Majesty's authority. The situation in the neutral camp was chaotic. At that time, Many rumors said that the bitch's student was the return of a peak figure in the Order camp. As long as he killed him and got his core, he could set foot on the peak of the Order camp while maintaining the neutral camp's position, just like Her Highness Qin Wei Bai. In the chaotic situation, there would always be people who wanted to take risks. Countless forces wanted to capture that student, but in fact, it was tantamount to targeting and making things difficult for King Wei. King Wei killed some blind people, which made his position a little awkward. Now there are rumors in the legends that King Wei bullied the weak and feared the strong, and would often call for help. Many people in the central state ridiculed this. But in reality, King Wei killed a few small people hoping that the neutral camp would wake up. But the result was worse and worse, and even some people that King Wei knew appeared. How could he deal with such people? He could only use the excuse that he was seriously injured and was no match for the other side, so he asked the people of the Order camp to come forward. But the result was also not good. He stood in the Order camp and called for help from the Order camp. No one cared about what he thought, only the result. So countless forces thought that King Wei betrayed the camp, and their hostility toward him was unprecedentedly strong. And the Order camp frequently took action to solve the problem, and gradually became a little dissatisfied with the existence of King Wei. Lin Xianyuan was silent for a while. Then he smiled bitterly. So in this situation, that bitch reversed the camp's hostility toward King Wei and turned it against him. So, another King Wei who was exactly the same as him but was fundamentally different was born. It was a fake King Wei who was the same as King Wei in appearance, internal energy form and combat power. For each other's survival, they fought from the neutral camp to the chaos camp, and then to the Order camp. At that time, the idea of the Order camp was undoubtedly to kill the real King Wei and let the fake King Wei replace him and become the strongest divine weapon of the Order camp. But this plan failed in the end, and the fake King Wei was killed by the Order camp's peak figures, while the real King Wei continued to escort that student. But this point, only King Wei and the important figures of the Order camp knew that the dead King Wei was a fake. No one else knew, not even the other higher-ups of the Order camp, let alone the people of the neutral camp. Most importantly, King Wei had accumulated a lot of hostility from the neutral camp, and he couldn't prove his innocence at all. The Order camp made him return to the neutral camp because they wanted to see internal chaos in the neutral camp. Fortunately, at that time His Majesty ascended to the throne? Lin Shi asked. I don't remember clearly. Xianyuan Wushang thought for a moment, then shook his head and smiled. Before my father ascended to the throne, there should have been a long period of struggle. Facing the hostility of his own people, he didn't explain anything and just protected the entire neutral camp behind him. He fought to the death against the Order camp and the Chaos camp, accumulating more and more hidden injuries. This can be said to be the foreshadowing of his death. This turbulent situation continued until my father grasped the authority left behind by His Majesty and successfully ascended to the throne. My father found a divine form that His Majesty had left behind, and King Wei took the initiative to use his own soul to contain that divine form. Everyone knew that if he leaned towards the Order camp or the Chaos camp, it would be impossible to contain that divine form. It was also at that time that King Wei regained his innocence, but not long after he died. Lin Shi listened in a daze, somewhat understanding. The divine form that contained His Majesty was after King Wei returned from the Order camp? This is the only explanation, Xianyuan Wushang said. Xianyuan Wushang said, but no one remembers the specific details. Lin Shi shook his head as if he wanted to say something, but in the end he didn't say anything. You're about to cast a divine form, aren't you? No, some time ago it seemed that you already had your first divine form, but in the end it was not confirmed. Xianyuan Wushang suddenly asked. I'm already casting the prototype of the third divine form. My 3 divine forms are all at the beginning stage and they are all prototypes. Lin Shi said softly. Xianyuan Wushang was silent for a moment, then looked at Lin Shi and said, Then what are you afraid of? Are you afraid of death? Who knows which divine form His Majesty will fuse with? Lin Shi said slowly. He paused for a moment then continued, but you're right. If King Wei and His Majesty can deal with Jiang Shangyu, it will indeed save a lot of trouble and make up for our previous mistakes. We should do something for His Majesty and King Wei. Xianyuan Wushang looked at the transparent screen in front of him. On the screen, King Wei was still standing quietly as if thinking about something. What Wuyo pursues is the greatest freedom, so it won't smoothly fuse with King Wei. Xianyuan Wushang said. There will be a fight. Lin Shi's voice was calm and indifferent. Once he had made up his mind, he had already cast aside all his worries in the shortest time possible. This is actually a good thing for you. Xianyuan Wushang smiled and said, the war god sent you here to face His Majesty not only to help you break through and reach the peak faster, but also to let His Majesty personally end you. That way at least you can return in the next reincarnation, and maybe you will gain more by facing His Majesty's half-divine form in advance. Lin Shi's pupils slowly contracted and condensed into a single pupil, which looked increasingly deep and serene. I know. He said something in a low voice. We don't know the specific state of Wuyo and that half-divine form, but we're almost sure that this battle won't be easy. Xianyuan Wushang paused, then said seriously, so before we set off, we need a specific battle plan. This also meant that they had to have a very detailed understanding of each other's abilities. No one was unfamiliar with this kind of teamwork. They had gone through a long period of time in countless battles, so they didn't need to cultivate tacit understanding at all. They could completely find a tacit understanding of each other. Lin Shi nodded expressionlessly and said, that's right. Chapter 1131. When the apostle walked in, there was still a clear trace of confusion on his face. Until now he still didn't know why Lin Shi decided to meet with Xianyuan Wushang. The war god's realm and the space-time corridor did have the same general standpoint. When they needed each other's support, no matter who it was, they would not hesitate. But in private, the real relationship between the two parties or even the three parties was really not harmonious. The former's high degree of agreement was an inevitable choice in the face of life and death. The latter, on the other hand, was a real dispute of interests. Xianyuan Wushang had suffered a big loss in the hands of Lin Shi's mother. When they met in Miracle City, they did not fight. Instead, they talked happily and conspired for a long time. In the apostle's view, this was quite incredible. The virtual screen in front of Xianyuan Wushang and Lin Shi was still on. The images of Li Tianlan and Wei Wang became the two largest screens. The man and the sword in the screen were very quiet. The apostle took a deep look at the screen in the room and bowed deeply to the man and the sword in the screen, solemnly and respectfully. In their hearts, the man and the sword in front of them were indeed worthy of respect. The former was indeed a tyrant that had never been seen before in the history of the human race, and there would never be another like him in the future. The latter had also been forced to join another camp, and they had indeed done so. However, no one was perfect and no one could erase their contributions to the human race. Your Highness. After silently bowing to Li Tianlan and Wu Qing, the apostle turned around and nodded to Lin Shi. Call Saint back. Lin Shi nodded and said directly. At this time, Saint was already in the Wang family of Beihai with Wang Xingxiao to investigate the specific situation of Wang Tianzong. Reviving Wang Tianzong was what they had to do. At this time they were still at the stage of understanding the situation. In this situation, it was not difficult for Saint to escape. The apostle nodded and gently raised his hand. The entire hotel turned into countless virtual lines in an instant. The virtual quantum network instantly covered the whole Zhongzhou state. What's the matter? The apostle's voice sounded directly. His Highness is looking for you. If you have nothing to do, come as soon as possible. The apostle said calmly. Inside a secret laboratory of the Wang family of Beihai, Saint answered, raised his wrist and pressed a small button on a wristwatch on his wrist. Most of the abilities of a holy disciple were focused on healing, recovery, and defense. This was the authority of the Order faction. There were very few humans who could reach the level of a holy disciple. This was also the reason why it was impossible for a top army to have two holy disciples. No force would be so extravagant and waste their resources. In theory, an apostle could completely affect the situation of a large-scale interstellar war, and a saint could similarly save the situation of a large-scale interstellar war. Compared to the destructive power of an apostle, a saint was the most welcomed support and partner of every faction. This meant that they had near-permanent battle endurance. But the saints also had a huge flaw. They lacked powerful head-on combat ability and mobility. Especially in a real environment like Miracle City, if one didn't have a teammate like Apostle or a similar item, it was impossible to roam such a long distance. The saint's wristwatch was a virtual coordinate that the Apostle had given her that could be used infinitely. Her pale fingers pressed the button on the wristwatch, and the light in the laboratory of the Wang family of Beihai was instantly distorted. The figure of Saint directly turned into a string of data that shuttled freely in the virtual world. The next second, her figure appeared in the room of the Yuzhou Hotel and reassembled into her original appearance. Saint nodded slightly. Her feet just stood in the hotel room. Before she could speak, Lin Shi, who never liked to talk nonsense, directly said, "Get ready. We'll go to the headquarters of the Lin clan and help King Wei take down Worryless." Get ready? Saint was a little confused. King Wei was in a very bad state now. The carefree state was also the lowest point of the lowest point. What was there to prepare for? And His Highness actually wanted them to attack together? Don't be careless. He's weak, but he's also a part of King Wei. And I just learned that Heartless is King Wei's body, Worryless is King Wei's core, and Worryless, to some extent, it's a part of King Wei's emotions and thoughts. Plus, His Majesty Li Tianlan is half of the divine form. You know what this means? If we're careless, it's very likely that we won't be able to come back this time. The bodies of Saint and Apostle shook for a very obvious moment. Divine form. His Majesty Li Tianlan's divine form. Completely out of instinct, their expressions suddenly became extremely serious. So to some extent, Worryless is more dangerous than Worryless. His essential state should be a little worse than Worryless, but as long as he can drive that half of the divine form, none of us is a match for him. Lin Shi said slowly. Drive the divine form in Miracle City? Apostle couldn't help but say. The divine form was also affected by the real environment, and its power would be sharply reduced. But no matter how reduced it was, if Worryless chose to drive the divine form in Miracle City, it was enough to cause great or even irreversible damage to Miracle City. If the situation really came to this point, not to mention him and Saint, even Lin Shi and Xianyuan Wushang would be sentenced to death. Of course not in Miracle City. Lin Shi glanced at him and said, "At the beginning of the battle, you're responsible for the space transfer and put the battlefield in the starry sky of other star areas. This way it's easier for us to play and we don't have to worry about damage." The corners of Saint's mouth twitched, and he and Apostle revealed a bitter smile almost at the same time. That's right, after the space transfer in the starry sky of other star areas, without the influence of the real environment of Miracle City, all of their means would be restored to their peak and there would be no more restrictions. It would be hundreds of millions of times better than it was now. This sounded very good. But if they really moved the battlefield, they wouldn't be the only ones who would not be affected by the real environment. Worryless and that half of the divine form would also not be affected by the real environment. As a part of King Guard, Worryless' rapid energy recovery method itself needed a kind of cosmic ray that was very special to Miracle City but was common in the starry sky. The prestige at the peak of the complete state was completely different from the current so-called murderous weapon and Heartless. There was no such thing as a recovery period. He could use all kinds of cosmic rays to replenish himself at any time and he would never feel tired. He was simply a real perpetual motion machine. If in the starry sky, no one could be sure how much Worryless could recover after absorbing cosmic rays. The most important thing was that half of the divine form. The half of the divine form that belonged to the First Majesty under the starry sky. In the real environment, this half of the divine form could at most exert the combat power close to that of the Chosen One. But once it left the real environment, Apostle and Saint couldn't imagine what they would face. Which divine form of His Majesty merged with Worryless? Apostle took a deep breath and asked softly. My memory is a little fuzzy. Xianyuan Wushang shook his head and said, if there is no accident, that half of the divine form is very likely to be a catastrophe. A catastrophe? The Apostle muttered to himself in a somewhat stupefied manner. Saint glanced at him and seemed to feel some sympathy. Are you sure it's not Zhou Di? Lin Shi asked seriously and solemnly. I can confirm it. Xianyuan Wushang nodded and said, Zhou Di should be in the depths of Her Highness Qin Weibai's consciousness now. This is probably the only divine form whose whereabouts are clearly known. Lin Shi's face relaxed slightly and he glanced at Apostle. Everyone was looking at Apostle. The legend about the catastrophe should be spread in the realm of war gods. So, if it is difficult, I suggest a war of attrition. Even if Worryless cooperates with a single divine form, it will not be really perfect. There are still flaws. A war of attrition is the safest way. A war of attrition, Apostle murmured and looked at Xianyuan Wushang as if he wanted to scold him. Finally, he relied on his absolute strong willpower to control himself. He took 2 deep breaths and said slowly, "I suspect that you are targeting me, but I have no evidence." So, Xianyuan Wushang raised his eyebrows. Apostle narrowed his eyes and looked at him seriously for a while. Suddenly he laughed and said, "No so. If my existence makes the 9th prince feel uneasy, then I am honored." "You think too much." Xianyuan Wushang smiled and said, "This is the time-space corridor. We don't need to feel uneasy about an apostle." Apostle looked deeply at Xianyuan Wushang and then at Lin Shi. He said softly, "Your Highness, I am fine." Lin Shi grunted and looked at Xianyuan Wushang. "I am not familiar with the time-space corridor. Give me the coordinates." The universe seemed vast, but finding a suitable coordinate was not easy. There were no civilizations near Miracle City. This place itself was a sword formation and it was extremely exquisite. Lin Shi and the others would not start a war here unless they wanted to commit suicide. Outside of Miracle City's sword formation, the time-space corridor was already covered in the flames of war. A large number of resource planets were also firmly protected. There were not many places like this that did not destroy resources and did not attract the attention of other places. Xianyuan Wushang raised his eyebrows and asked Apostle, "What do you want?" "Big enough. Must be big enough." Apostle's voice was very calm, but it carried a trace of restraint and arrogance that everyone could clearly see. Catastrophe was one of the divine forms of the martial path. Experts in the field of the apostle could be said to be experts in dealing with experts of the martial path. They had a strong restraining effect on the martial path. Everyone knew that apostle would be the main force in this battle, so they naturally had to create the best conditions for him. As expected of one of the oldest apostles in the war god realm. His family is indeed rich. Xianyuan Wushang gave him a thumbs up. The apostle said calmly, "I can't compare to the seniors in the time-space corridor. But the fire seed has been in good condition recently, so I can squander it for once." After a pause, apostle smiled and looked at Xianyuan Wushang. "I will move a part of the headquarters here. You don't have any objections, do you?" Chapter 1132. Xianyuan Wushang knew better than anyone what an apostle's headquarters meant, so while the other party's words seemed like a joke, it was in fact an extremely serious matter. The apostle was talking about a part of the headquarters. But even a part of it was a great test of Xianyuan Wushang's ability to choose the battlefield. Xianyuan Wushang seriously thought for a while, then suddenly raised his palm. Droplets of pure, almost transparent light shone from his palm and gathered in front of them, finally forming a light screen. Countless shining spots of light gathered on the light screen at an unimaginable number. A large number of spots of light began to move away, and a portion of the spots of light rearranged themselves, finally forming a huge oval whirlpool that was slowly rotating. Lin Shi raised his eyebrows slightly. "This is the revolving galaxy?" Xianyuan Wushang grunted in response. What he was displaying now was a detailed star map of the space-time corridor in the starry sky. The complete star map was blocked the moment it appeared, leaving only this domain called the revolving galaxy. The so-called spiraling galaxy was the Lagniakaya supercluster in Miracle City's scientific research, while the Virgo galaxy, which was more familiar to the public, was a part of it. The local galaxy, which was known to the public, was a part of Virgo. The Milky Way, which was very familiar to everyone, was also a part of the local galaxy, and the solar system, which was more familiar to everyone, was a part of the Milky Way. The space-time corridor did not accept the name Miracle City, but officially designated this supercluster as a star field, and named it the spiraling galaxy. Even in the entire territory of the space-time corridor, this area, which had a diameter of trillions of light-years, could be considered a first-class area of the space-time corridor. There was bound to be a peak figure presiding over it, and there were several saints or apostles like Xianyuan Wushang. This was already the back of the space-time corridor. Although it was still affected by the flames of war, it was relatively calm. This was also the node from the space-time corridor to the war god realm, so both sides were relatively familiar with each other. One of the main reasons Xianyuan Wushang chose this place as the battlefield was relatively close to the war god realm. Xianyuan Wushang's finger slowly moved. The galaxy clusters in the rotating Milky Way streaked past one after another. The stars in the sky were constantly shining, followed by the galaxy clusters and then the galaxy clusters. On the screen formed by the clear light, the vortex quickly zoomed in and out. The apostle's eyes narrowed slightly, a fine radiance flickering within them. Less than a second later, Xianyuan Wushang already began to laugh. Her Highness the eldest princess is still watching this place. If you don't want to die, it's best if you behave yourself. The apostle stared blankly for a moment before releasing a cold snort. Although he did not speak, the light in his eyes had completely disappeared. Although Xianyuan Wushang could search for a suitable battlefield very quickly, the apostle could completely record the appearance of the star domain Xianyuan Wushang had revealed in the shortest amount of time. He had used the network to invade the entire star field and obtain the most detailed information about them. This wasn't very useful in the grand scheme of things, but when the War God realm and the space-time corridor clashed, this information could play an extremely crucial role. Feng Qinggu didn't allow him to use those abilities in Miracle City, so this kind of record was naturally not allowed. Here then. Xianyuan Wushang smiled. What appeared in front of them was another vortex. Although it was not as magnificent as the spinning galaxy, it was still shocking. This was also an area that Lin Shi and the apostle were very familiar with. Whether it was Miracle City, the space-time corridor, or the War God Realm's human imperial palace, they all used the same name for this place. The Milky Way Galaxy. The battlefield that Xianyuan Wushang had locked onto was located at the edge of the Milky Way Galaxy's halo. There were few planets and there were no civilizations or resource planets. It was covered in a large amount of cosmic dust. It was a barren wasteland, and for the time being, it had not been affected by the flames of war. If he wanted to find a battlefield near Miracle City, this was the most suitable place. Xianyuan Wushang glanced at the apostle. The apostle raised his eyes and glanced at the battlefield on the screen. The entire process took less than half a second. Three-dimensional images began to form in his mind. His expression changed slightly, instantly becoming a little ugly and a little angry. What's wrong? Lin Shi sensed the apostle's abnormality. I've already grasped the battlefield's coordinates. I can move at any time. The apostle glared at Xianyuan Wushang, his eyes blazing with anger. Where is it? Lin Shi asked indifferently. In the land of freedom. The apostle gnashed his teeth as he spoke word by word. Lin Shi's expression changed slightly and he immediately fell silent. The land of freedom. For the War God realm and the human emperor palace, this term was not very good. When the term land of freedom appeared, Lin Shi had not yet been born. This was the place where the human emperor of the human emperor palace and the war god of the war god realm challenged great emperor Xianyuan of the time corridor for the first time after reaching the peak. The result was self-evident. The two of them joined forces, but they failed. And it was a crushing defeat. The battle lasted less than 2 seconds, and the war god and the human emperor were defeated without any room to fight back. This was the first time that the two of them fought for their freedom and not being bound by the time corridor. This kind of challenge was carried out a total of 3 times. The first 2 times the two of them were defeated. But the third time they didn't fight. Great Emperor Xianyuan of the time corridor recognized the independence of the war god and the human emperor, and then in the challenge that didn't result in a fight, he separated Miracle City. Xianyuan Wushang regarded this place as a battlefield. It couldn't be said that he had evil intentions, but it did make people a little uncomfortable. This was at least an unscrupulous prank. Thank you. Lin Shi was silent for a long time and then said without any emotion. It was really uncomfortable here. But it was very close to the time corridor. If the apostle wanted to move the headquarters, it would undoubtedly be easier if it was closer. Xianyuan Wushang nodded casually. The expressionless Lin Shi slowly turned around and glanced at the apostle. Let's go. The screen in the hotel bedroom disappeared completely. One after another, virtual lines enveloped everyone. A series of digitized figures disappeared in an instant. The next second, in the sky above the worry-free manor of the Lin clan, the apostle appeared directly with Lin Shi, Xianyuan Wushang, and the others. The moment the data quickly merged, the apostle's eyes lit up with a blue light. There seemed to be endless lightning flashing and rushing in his eyes. Time completely stopped. The entire worry-free manor was completely virtualized. At the moment when time stopped, the entire worry-free manor almost didn't exist at all, because this area had become a virtual world. In the virtual world, an ordinary-looking tree stood out from the rest. Time stopped. However, the tree seemed to have sensed something and suddenly began to shake violently. In the virtual world, reality was the most dazzling lighthouse. And for the neutral camp, Li Tianlan's original half-divine form was the most dazzling reality. The apostle, with lightning flashing in his eyes, pressed his hands down. In an instant the violently struggling tree disappeared with all of them, as if it had never existed. The suspended time continued to pass. The whole process took less than a millisecond. The worry-free manner returned to reality again. No one could notice the 1 millisecond pause of time. But this manner was a millisecond slower than the whole world at this time. At the same time, 4,000 light-years away in a barren land of freedom, the apostle Xianyuan Wushang Lin Shi Xingtian and Saint appeared directly in the cosmic void where there was a lot of floating dust. There was only solemnity on Xianyuan Wushang's chubby face. He silently observed the surrounding situation and slowly turned his head. Then he saw the apostle who had also brought them here. F***ck. Xianyuan Wushang suddenly cursed. He pointed at the apostle. Why are you here? What are you doing here? Chapter 1133. Apostles were undoubtedly the main force of this battle. No one would doubt this. But when the battlefield shifted, Xianyuan Wushang couldn't help but be astonished to see him here. Apostle's initial level of authority in the starry sky was called Scholar. To some extent, this path belonged to the Order faction, and it largely determined the survival and death of the entire world. Their destructive power was undoubtedly number one, and there was no doubt that they were extremely powerful. But corresponding to this powerful destructive power, their bodies were much weaker than anyone else's. Therefore, before reaching level 4 authority, apart from a few rare existences, everyone on this path could be considered the most standard of trash. Only after reaching level 4 authority could they form initial combat power, and after reaching level 5 authority, they would completely erupt and become more and more powerful. But no matter how powerful they were, even if they reached the peak of this path and became the apocalypse, compared to other peak figures, their much weaker bodies were still a flaw that couldn't be considered a flaw. This flaw really existed, but almost no one could take advantage of it. At the level of apostles, they could completely not appear on any battlefield and still maintain extremely powerful combat power. Apostles were the 8th level authority of scholars, and it was also the peak of the authority that a neutral faction could use to the Order faction. At this level, as the main force, apostles didn't need to appear on any battlefield at all, but they could still cause absolute destruction on any battlefield. Their true bodies could do anything in any corner of the world, and they could play a huge role far away from the battlefield. The so-called weakness of a weak body was not a weakness at all in a situation where the enemy couldn't even find their true bodies. The authority of an apostle was definitely at the peak of the neutral faction. The War God realm had sent him here not only because he was Lin Shi's protector in the early days and had an extremely good relationship with Lin Shi, but also because the War God realm wanted to show off their power. In other words, standing in the position of an apostle could already represent the War God realm to show off their power to the outside world. Such a person was now sent here to be an introducer. Such extravagance. If it wasn't necessary, even the space-time corridor wouldn't do this. This meant the mobilization of countless resources and military power. According to the space-time corridor's intelligence, the apostle following Lin Shi had a specific position, and it was a very important position in the War God realm. Before coming to Miracle City, he was overseeing a star field. What kind of concept was a star field? For example, the galaxy they were currently in had a true diameter of nearly 1 trillion light-years. This was a medium to large star region. Under normal circumstances, such a star field would need a peak expert to oversee it, 3 to 5 lower-level assistants, and hundreds of millions of large armies and battleships that could occupy the entire starry sky. When it came to individuals, it would be an unimaginable number. This was the standard garrison size of a normal star field. Endless armies and battleships. And in that part of the planet where the apostles reside, but there were no such things in the domain. That star area was no smaller than the rotating Milky Way, but if all the garrisons in that star area were added up, there was only one person. The apostles. Not a single so-called human army had a deputy. He was alone. It was true that he wasn't a match for those at the pinnacle, but he was able to oversee a star field all by himself. The only answer was that he was an apostle. But now, the apostle's true body actually teleported. Was this man, who represented the power of the space-time corridor in the outside world, planning to commit suicide? Xianyuan Wushang silently looked at the apostle next to him. A saint's direct combat strength was at the bottom of all kinds of authorities. But facing an apostle who dared to teleport himself, Xianyuan Wushang felt that if the two of them fought, he might be able to seriously injure the apostle. The apostle stood next to Lin Shi and looked around the starry sky. He smiled faintly and said, "I'm more useful here. If Wuyo is in a good state, perhaps just a wave of sword qi can seriously injure your true body." Xianyuan Wushang sneered in exasperation. The apostle turned his head and looked at Xianyuan Wushang seriously. After a while he suddenly laughed. "Ninth Prince, which eye of yours saw that this is my true body?" Xianyuan Wushang was stunned and didn't know what to say for a moment. Not his true body. He is now completely worthy of the title given to him by the human race. They always call him the Peak Apostle. Not long ago he set foot on the true peak that belongs to him. Lin Shi said softly. Xianyuan Wushang and Xing Tian were shocked at the same time. The apostle wasn't the peak. But the neutral camp had always been called the Peak Apostle. Those who were worthy of this title were all creatures of the neutral camp who had reached the extreme or were infinitely close to the extreme on the path of order. In other words, it was the 8-9 level of authority. Or infinitely close to the 9 level of authority. There was once such a peak apostle in the space-time corridor a long time ago. That was his sister who had fallen and hadn't returned. He didn't know if she could return or not. Xianyuan Wushang was silent for a while and looked deeply at the apostle. "No wonder you are so confident. Congratulations." The apostle nodded. His true body was still on Earth. Perhaps he had already sneaked into the Lin clan's kitchen to enjoy the delicious food. This was just a manifestation of his consciousness clone. He could move to another target at any time. When his true body was far away from the battlefield, he would be in almost no danger. His gaze fell on the distant starry sky. There seemed to be nothing under the extremely distant starry sky. But everyone could feel that there was an incomparably majestic sword qi in that area that had begun to rapidly boil in the shortest time possible. Large amounts of cosmic dust in the surroundings were constantly turbulent. All kinds of invisible cosmic rays were rapidly withdrawn. They turned into incomparably dazzling streams of flowing light that converged toward that area. 2 incomparably bright rays of light shot over from afar. They were sharp, cold, and full of contempt and arrogance. Combined with Li Tianlan's original half-divine form, he was also constantly absorbing cosmic rays. King Wei's long-dormant consciousness directly awakened in an instant. Those 2 rays of light were King Wei's gaze. Facing that gaze, the apostle subconsciously narrowed his eyes. He took a deep breath and bowed slightly. His calm voice came from afar. "Apostle Lin Wushang, General Wei of the State of War Realm, Duke Wei, greets your highness." "Prince of the War Realm Lin Shi greets your highness." Lin Shi also bowed slightly. "Deputy Commander of the War Realm's Guard Army, Saint Han Wei, greets your highness." One voice after another was transmitted over. Xianyuan Wushang bowed slightly and said with a smile, "Ninth Prince of the Space-Time Corridor Xianyuan Wushang greets Uncle Wei." Xing Tian didn't say anything. In such a scene he had the lowest authority and the lowest position. He had no right to speak at all. The endless void suddenly fluctuated for a moment. No sound came from there. But everyone's soul began to fluctuate at the same time. King Wei's will was clearly transmitted through the incomparably intense soul fluctuation. "Get lost." At the same time as the soul fluctuation, an incomparably dazzling sword light was transmitted. In an instant, the extremely dazzling sword light directly spread from one point to the entire starry sky, arriving in an instant. The apostle slowly stood up, reached out his hand and snapped his fingers. A faint blue light suddenly shone from his pupils. The void was silently torn apart. The endless space kept boiling and a large amount of cosmic dust kept twisting in the chaos. In everyone's sight, a metal planet many times larger than an ordinary star slowly appeared on the battlefield. There were no words, no orders, no communication. In the face of the approaching sword light, the torrent of steel instantly blotted out the sky and covered the sun. On the smooth surface of the metal planet, the mighty mechanical army under the control of the apostle's thoughts moved at full speed, rushing in the direction of the flying sword light. Millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions. The mechanical warriors were endless. On the planet, densely packed torrents kept rising into the sky more and more, and there was no end to them. This was the apostle's mechanical army. A mechanical army that belonged to him alone. Every soldier in the army could be considered as his creations. He was the creator of the entire mechanical army. And what he possessed was far more than just a mechanical army. This was also the source of his confidence in overseeing the entire star field alone. He didn't need an army made up of human armies. He didn't need complicated logistical supplies. His existence alone was equivalent to trillions of mechanical legions. Chapter 1134. The Apostle's figure disappeared. Or rather, his figure didn't exist at all. That virtual image was essentially a clone condensed by a wisp of his battle consciousness. When his mechanical army was completely spread out on the battlefield, his consciousness clone could appear on any mechanical carrier of the mechanical army at will. This was the power that belonged to the Apostle. This also meant that in most situations, the Apostle didn't even need to descend with his real body. He only needed a thought to start a war that would sweep through the entire starfield. And no matter how chaotic the situation was, the Apostle could be said to be the most difficult creature to kill in all kinds of wars. This was the case for the Apostle. The doomsday would only be more exaggerated. Because of this, Lin Xianyuan, who had single-handedly killed an doomsday war god at the cost of being seriously injured, was considered to be at the peak of individual strength in recent years. He was the sharpest human. The mechanical army was majestic in the void. The mechanical army at the forefront accelerated in a straight line and rushed out of everyone's sight in the blink of an eye. The densely packed machinery almost completely covered the starry sky. Their numbers were increasing. The huge steel planet in the void got rid of the starry sky's gravity and rotated crazily, bursting with a dazzling blue light. Thousands of mechanical torrents seemed to endlessly rush into the void, accelerating and accelerating continuously. At the forefront of the mechanical torrent, a strong light shone silently. The moment the strong light appeared, it began to spread crazily in all directions. Fire. Thousands, millions, hundreds of millions, billions of mechanical army crazily fired at that worryless sword light. Photon cannons, destruction cannons, high-temperature concentrated laser beams, antimatter energy cannons, dark matter missile arrays. The violent firepower that filled the void instantly ignited the sword energy. The sword energy and all kinds of cannons exploded at the same time, and the entire void constantly shook and twisted. The scattered sword light rushed into the mechanical army, and all kinds of machinery fell in large numbers. More mechanical army rushed forward without any hesitation. Xianyuan Wuxiang and the saint took a step forward at the same time and opened their arms. The holy light was like rain. The pure light directly covered the entire battlefield in a breath's time. The moment the holy light sprinkled on the mechanical army at the forefront, a seemingly thin but extremely tough transparent shield appeared on their bodies. The mechanical army's cracked bodies began to quickly recover under the cover of the holy light. Countless heavily injured mechanical army began to quickly recover, and they received the protection of the saint. Xianyuan Wuxiang kept waving his hands. Unlike the saint's holy light that shrouded the entire battlefield, every time he waved his hand, it didn't look spectacular, but the void around him vibrated with every wave of his hand. The void around him seemed to have become a lake. He stood in the center of the lake, his every move causing a large ripple. The ripples quickly spread across the entire battlefield, spreading to every mechanical body. That there were layers upon layers of buffs. Super speed, super healing, extreme penetration, damage transfer, damage absorption. As Xianyuan Wuxiang waved his hand, dozens of buffs fell evenly on each mechanical body. More and more machines appeared. The holy light on the saint's body became more and more majestic. The vibrations around Xianyuan Wuxiang grew more and more rapid. Outside of everyone's line of sight, the will that was still growing stronger in the void instantly became extremely cold. The sword light was becoming chaotic. Dense explosions kept erupting in the void. The holy light fell like rain or a waterfall. With Xianyuan Wuxiang at the center, the entire battlefield seemed to have become a rippling sea. The will fell silent. An incomparably sharp light appeared in the center of the battlefield. The dazzling void seemed to be silent for a moment. A black shadow appeared among the densely packed mechanical army. It was just a blurry outline of a human figure. The cosmic radiation from all directions gathered crazily with him as the center. As his figure became clearer, the continuous explosions and holy light behind him suddenly disappeared. It was as if nothing had happened. It was so sudden that no one could react. The truth was in front of everyone. Worryless broke through the outer blockade of the mechanical army. Or it shouldn't be called a breakthrough. The instantaneous shortening of distance was not the so-called teleportation at all. It was speed. Fast. Too fast. It was a speed that surpassed the mind at close range. One step, one sword. The mechanical army outside the apostle was instantly destroyed, and he appeared in the center of the mechanical army. A misty but extremely condensed light surged from behind the blurry outline of a human figure. That was already extremely fast. Because it was the speed of light. The sword light kept traveling at the speed of light in the void. The moment the light surged, Xianyuan Wuxiang vaguely saw the scene behind Worryless. The mechanical bodies all over the sky were directly torn apart by the sword. The light on the mechanical bodies was extinguished and they fell from the void. Countless holy light and the shadows of the explosions were all disintegrated by the sword light, turning into darkness. This scene lasted for less than a 10,000th of a second. The impact of this scene was still lingering in his eyes. The invisible sword light had directly reached Xianyuan Wuxiang. This sudden burst of sword light had already surpassed the speed of pure light in the void. The light was in front. The light was behind. The sword swept across. The cosmic radiation from all directions gathered on Worryless and condensed into one spot. It burst out. The moment the light shone behind him, the sword light had directly torn apart all the defense and clothes on Xianyuan Wuxiang's body. Crack. The sword light, which had almost touched Xianyuan Wuxiang's body, suddenly twisted. In the slight twist, the light behind him finally merged with the sword light, turning into a misty gray. And in front of Xianyuan Wuxiang, a gray sword light also burst out. The same sword intent. The same sword energy. The same fierceness and determination. Standing beside Xianyuan Wuxiang and Saint, Lin Shi opened his hands. The surging sword energy crazily burst out with him as the center, and finally formed a sword light that was exactly the same as Worryless. The two sword lights directly collided, kept merging and finally cancelled each other out. Without any hesitation, Xianyuan Wuxiang and Saint retreated at the same time. Lin Shi's body stiffened in the void. He silently looked in front of him. In his sight, the last two fused sword intents were still entangling with each other, and it seemed that they were equally matched. He used the same sword move as Worryless in a 10,000th of a second. The sword intents of both sides were completely the same in this sword move. Exactly the same. But Lin Shi didn't know what this sword move was. He was a Jura of the Warring God realm. This was a path exclusive to the neutral camp. The initial authority was called Martial Artist. On the path of Martial Artist, the authority before a Jura was called Heavenly End. It was the same as the thought clone of Apostle. Heavenly End also had its own authority. It was called Copy. In less than a 10,000th of a second he completely copied Worryless' sword move, which was enough to kill Xianyuan Wuxiang in an instant. At that time he didn't have time to think whether it was King Wei's or His Majesty's. But it didn't seem to matter. In front of Lin Shi, Worryless' vague figure paused and tilted his head slightly as if looking at a fool. Lin Shi was indifferent. He had lost his sight, hearing and feeling and was about to lose his last consciousness. Worryless' figure fluctuated and instantly disappeared from Lin Shi's side. He didn't even bother to touch the Prince of the Warring God realm. Lin Shi's figure was stiff, floating. The endless sword light and mechanical wreckage behind him slowly twisted and turned into cosmic dust. It floated over like a storm and covered his body. Bang! The blood rain that filled the sky exploded without warning, merging with the floating cosmic dust. Lin Shi's whole body directly and completely exploded in the void, turning into the tiniest particles, leaving no bones. Chapter 1135. Copy was the core power of the Heavenly Jew. In a sense, it was a simulation of the rules of the world. It was not a simple imitation but more like a mirror image. Copy the opponent's attack and achieve the same physical meaning. This was the key and core of the Heavenly Jew's power. But copy was not omnipotent. The authority of the Heavenly Jew could copy almost any form of attack from the opponent, but there was a limit to the endurance of the Heavenly Jew's body. When the attack was beyond the limit of the body, the copy could be completed, but the collapse of the body was also irreversible. The superluminal sword light came from Li Tianlan's figure and Wei Wang's energy. No matter which one it was not something Lin Shi could bear. He could complete the copy but he had to bear the price of death. Wu Lu continued to rush forward without any hesitation. In the shortest time possible, the blurry human silhouette began to become clearer as the cosmic radiation continued to converge. The boundless sword light chased after the sword aura, causing a huge commotion in the endless mechanical army. Wu Lu raised his palm. The sharpness that could tear everything bloomed again and condensed instantly. There was no delay or accumulation. Wei Wang's palm chopped down straight toward Xianyuan Wushang. The mechanical torrent shuttling in the sky all changed direction in less than half a second. The mechanical army completely stopped. The Apostles' order was clearly transmitted inside the thinking center of every mechanical army. The dense mechanical torrent flashed and jumped in the void. The moment the sword light appeared in Wu Lu's hand, it seemed like the endless mechanical torrent blocked in front of Xianyuan Wushang and Saint. The dazzling mechanical army began to pile up crazily. There was a humanoid armor shining with a cold light, a multi-barrel cannon with a huge caliber, a void fighter covered with armed weapons, a mechanical fortress that could attack and defend, a reconnaissance satellite that could enhance the speed of thought transmission, a heavy tank that could sweep everything in a positional battle, a liquid mechanical soldier with super high energy, a mechanical general made entirely of dark matter, a small assault spaceship and antimatter missile array. There were so many of them. In the blink of an eye, thousands of machines with powerful firepower began to pile up between Xianyuan Wushang and Wu Lu. All the gaps were filled in an instant. In less than a blink of an eye, the hundreds of millions of mechanical army directly built a metal wall without any gaps in front of Xianyuan Wushang. The walls were completely closed and the surface was absolutely smooth without any warmth. The gigantic metal planet that did not seem to belong to this spacetime but affected the battlefield was still rotating, generating a huge gravitational force. The mechanical torrents on the planet were countless, and the vast mechanical army was still rushing to the battlefield, forming this wall. The sword lights that remained on the battlefield swept through the mechanical army one after another. However, the number of the mechanical army was becoming denser and denser at a speed visible to the naked eye. There were so many that it made people despair. The absolutely smooth wall that Wu You and Xianyuan Wushang had built before kept growing thicker and thicker. In the next second, the sword light in Wu Yu's hand flew out and hit the high wall. There was no sound in the void. The high wall that almost covered the void suddenly shook violently for a moment. The absolutely smooth wall radiated light, and Wu Yu's sword light was completely reflected back. At the same time, blood-red characters appeared abruptly in the void. A large number of characters revolved around Worryless energy body. At the outermost perimeter of the battlefield, the gigantic Xingtian was writing rapidly in the void, constantly changing the rules of the entire battlefield. This person is forbidden from interacting with the universe. Martial arts are restricted here. Machinery is strengthened. The void here is weak, suitable for long-distance teleportation. Energy bodies are restricted here. Consumption is increased. Burn. Disease. Weakness. Slow. Tear. Blindness. Chaos. Misfortune. More and more characters appeared and they were as dense as rain. Xingtian quickly changed some of the rules into rules that were beneficial to his side. Then all the strokes became extremely eye-catching curses. Xingtian's incomparably powerful aura weakened in an instant. Before his peak, calligraphers were not suitable for a prolonged battle, but they were able to achieve instant results in a short period of time. The sword light was completely reflected off the wall. Wu Yu instinctively wanted to dodge. He planned to go left but his body directly rushed forward. Chaos curse. The distance between him and the sword light was quickly shortened, and the surrounding void was completely boiling. There were no flames, but the cold void was suddenly filled with a violent high temperature. The high temperature was like fire, continuously evaporating his energy. The burning void emitted countless viruses that suppressed energy bodies. The viruses kept spreading in Wu Yu's body. His movements were clearly slowed down and even his vision was starting to be affected. The reflection of the sword light completely enveloped him. The majestic sword energy pierced through all the weak parts of Wu Yu's body that had not absorbed enough cosmic energy. The powerful energy started to spread everywhere. This was the misfortune and tear curse. At the same time, the wall suddenly disintegrated under the impact of the sword light. The densely packed mechanical army once again returned to its battle form. Countless weapon systems locked onto Wu Yu surrounded him in the middle and suddenly opened fire. Light. There was strong light everywhere. The strong light instantly dispelled the darkness in the void. The silent battlefield was like a star that had completely exploded. The destructive power spread out crazily, spreading to the distance. In the distance there was a huge desolate planet. The star ring formed by all kinds of meteorites suddenly shattered into space dust. The shock wave with a strong light penetrated the surface of the planet from the void, into the crust, deep into the mantle and directly shattered the planet's core. The entire planet burned with flames under the mighty shockwave, and then silently shattered into pieces, exploding into a horrifying wreckage. We was still under the weakness and slow curse. The densely packed mechanical army kept gathering in the strong light, and all the machines started to closely connect. Hundreds of millions of machines all gathered together. At the same time, all the curses written by Xianxia suddenly became ineffective. An extremely strict will swept across the entire battlefield. The curse here is ineffective. The rules here are restored. The martial path here is strengthened. The energy surging here is accelerating. In the distance, Xianxia's body shook violently. The brush tip in his hand that was condensed from space directly exploded in his hand. His rules and curses were completely modified. In a short period of time he no longer had the ability to modify the rules. The terrible injury backfired in his body and his clear figure dimmed a little. This was not an easy price to pay, but it was not unacceptable. This was the most direct collision between Xianxia and Wu Yu. From this, they could directly feel the specific level of authority of Wu Yu in this state. Wei Wang's body was seriously injured. Li Tianlan was far from returning. In this state Wu Yu could not reach his peak state. This moment of collision was enough to let everyone see his level. The peak of level 7 authority. In terms of data it was level 7 and 9 authority. This was a lower authority than most people present. No one would underestimate Wu Yu. In this situation, Wu Yu had inherited part of the fighting consciousness of the original His Majesty and Wei Wang. Even if those two didn't have high authority, the power they could exert was also unimaginable. But this was indeed not a high authority, but it gave everyone the hope of victory. The strong light finally dissipated. Wu Yu's figure walked out of the afterglow of the light step by step. Indifferent, calm and calm. His figure had obviously become a lot more illusory in this round of attacks, but his invincible sharpness was getting stronger. The battlefield was no longer in the void. Wu Yu's figure stepped on the hard metal ground. The vast mechanical army that had once covered the starry sky had completely merged into one. They combined and locked each other, finally forming a metal planet the size of an ordinary star, but with a much lower mass. This was an armed fortress that belonged to the apostles. After leaving the void, any corner of this metal planet could be said to be the home field of the apostles. Endless mechanical armies kept flying out of another illusory metal planet. The torrent of metal still showed no signs of diminishing. Instead it became more and more overwhelming. An extremely lonely humanoid mecha appeared next to Xianyuan Wushang. The mecha was only slightly taller than ordinary people with smooth lines and didn't look very special. The next second the crystal in the mecha's eyes lit up with a dark blue electric light. TSK. This move again. Xianyuan Wushang clicked his tongue. The mecha didn't say anything but slightly raised its palm. A dark blue force field instantly appeared, enveloping Xianyuan Wushang the Saint and Xing Tian in the distance. The mecha suddenly took the three of them into the sky. At the same time Wu Yu on the ground began to accelerate. He moved faster and faster, rushing out of the ground and rising continuously, as if he wanted to directly rush out of this planet. The mechanical torrent that covered the sky all accelerated at this moment. Every mecha's mobility was increased to the limit. 1 million, 10 million, 100 million, a billion. The mechanical army that could cover everything directly hit the force field around Xianyuan Wushang. There was no explosion, no vibration. Countless mechas quickly assembled, constantly piecing together, repairing their weaknesses and strengthening their structure. The vast mechanical torrent was getting smaller and smaller. Xianyuan Wushang disappeared. Where the force field around him had been, a completely indomitable mechanical giant appeared. Mechanical fusion, doomsday projection. The strong sword light directly pierced the incomparably huge mechanical giant from the bottom up. The fierce cannon fire that could shatter everything roared on the metal planet without warning. The mechanical giant, which was at least 10,000 meters tall, was firing from every part of its body. It was firing endlessly. The sky was filled with artillery fire. The giant's huge arm suddenly pulled out a mechanical long blade from its back. Incredible explosions constantly spread from the long knife. The Apostle's doomsday projection gripped the long knife tightly. With continuous explosions and destruction, it directly slashed at Wu Yu. The sword light and the long knife filled with destructive explosions fiercely collided. In the ear-splitting buzzing sound, the huge doomsday projection's entire body lit up with holy light. Saint and Xianyuan Wushang, who were in the giant mechanical body, used all their strength to repair the doomsday projection's damage. The moment the doomsday projection's huge mechanical body collided with the sword light, it directly flew tens of thousands of kilometers away. Starlight filled the air, and the metal planet under the giant's feet shone at the same time. In this state, the giant and the metal planet were completely one, sharing energy, almost not afraid of a battle of attrition. Wu Yu's somewhat blurry facial features moved and he seemed to squint. He floated in the air, the shadow of his coat completely wrapped around his body. There was no communication, no pause. Wu Yu charged again. All the lights and shadows disappeared. In all directions, in the sky and on the ground, the countless roars of cannon fire seemed to have lost all color. Worryless became a tiny speck of light that was almost negligible. That light dot crossed the distance of tens of thousands of kilometers in the shortest time, almost at the speed of light. Earth-shaking sharpness. That was the sword light that was condensed to the extreme. It was also the half-divine form of the original His Majesty. Catastrophe. The giant slightly raised the long knife in his hand for a moment. As soon as the explosion of the blade was reflected, that light dot had directly pierced through the mechanical giant's body. Boom. The violent explosion seemed to become the only sound on the entire planet. The huge metal giant suddenly exploded. Arms, legs, torso, head, every part of the doomsday projection exploded into a large number of mechanical parts. The metal planet under the giant's feet constantly shook, and the size of the planet began to shrink at a speed visible to the naked eye. A large number of machinery broke away from the state of maintaining the planet, fusing with the giant. The giant was still disintegrating and more machinery began to fuse with him. In the short time between disintegration and fusion, the giant didn't hesitate at all. He raised the long knife and charged at Wu Yu again. All the mechanical energy on the entire planet vibrated at the same time. The mechanical giant didn't have the slightest bit of clumsiness. Every move it made was indescribably agile and domineering. The blade directly slashed at Wu Yu with a world-destroying explosion. Before the blade even got close, the entire space around Wu Yu had already begun to shatter inch by inch. Wu Yu raised his head and watched quietly. His blurry facial features revealed an indescribable calmness and contempt as he faced the earth-shattering blade. A somewhat blurry sword light suddenly rippled out from his body, slowly spreading and turning into a halo. More and more sword lights appeared, blurry and obscure. The sword lights that seemed to exist and yet not exist kept spreading around Wu Yu, circle after circle like ripples, and finally converged into a vast ocean. The dim sword light almost didn't have any sense of existence. It wasn't black nor was it white. It was a light gray that was a combination of black and white, a combination of everything. It was so light that it was almost invisible. It seemed to deliberately contain everything, but it could also destroy everything. Run! Xianyuan Wushang's somewhat hurried and distorted voice suddenly rang out from within the huge doomsday projection. This is the Sea of Chaos. Quickly disintegrate. The Sea of Chaos. Even in the current spacetime corridor, not many people knew this name. Occasionally, they would find some descriptions in the most ancient records. This was a stream of sword energy. It originated from the first emperor's sword energy. And this stream of sword energy had formed a divine form of the first emperor. It was called a catastrophe. The catastrophe was coming. Heaven and earth were all dead. Misty and obscure sword energy ripples suddenly spread out. The initial ripples spread to extremely distant places, eventually forming a vast ocean. The ocean surged on the metal planet. The metal planet disappeared. The ocean boiled in the void. The void disappeared. The entire battlefield instantly fell into absolute nothingness. The vast mechanical torrent, the vast expanse of cosmic dust, the brilliant light and shadow, the deathly silent void, everything disappeared. The sword light fluctuated, restoring everything it came into contact with to its original state of existence. It didn't exist. It was soundless. This was the most terrifying destruction. The omnipresent ocean of sword energy continued to spread on the huge doomsday projection. Worryless stood there quietly watching all of this. It wasn't that he didn't want to do something. It was that he couldn't do anything. He used the most fundamental power of the half-divine form. His aura was declining at an extremely obvious speed. Facing a peak apostle assisted by 2 saints and a calligrapher, this was the fastest way to deal with it. The huge doomsday projection began to take over. Even pure light was completely disintegrated into non-existent nothingness in this ocean of sword intent. The doomsday projection's towering mechanical body struggled wildly. He charged quickly in the ocean of sword energy. But the direction of his charge was not toward Worryless. Nor was he trying to escape. The huge body of the doomsday projection was rapidly melting, and the direction he was charging toward was an area of the previous battlefield. Worryless knew what he was going to do, but he couldn't do anything in a short time. The doomsday projection's legs were completely melted. The waist also began to disappear. Then the chest. But even so, the huge mechanical giant was still moving forward at all costs. He opened his hands and finally embraced the void that hadn't been melted by the ocean of sword energy. In the state of the naked eye, the mechanical giant was only embracing a vacuum. And in the vacuum there was a piece of dust that was constantly disintegrating. This area was the place where Lin Shi had just died. The mechanical giant held this area in his palm and rushed to the edge of the ocean of sword energy with all his strength. In the void in his palm, the constantly disintegrating dust was still disintegrating, turning into cells. The cells continued to divide, turning into the most basic atoms and molecules. The atoms and molecules that were hard to see with the naked eye were silent for a moment, then began to recombine and fuse. Cells full of vitality appeared again more and more. A figure began to become clear from the blurry. The mechanical giant, who only had 2 arms left, forcefully pushed his palm out of the edge of the ocean of sword energy. In his palm, the blurry silhouette held one of the mechanical giant's fingers. The finger, made of hundreds of millions of mechanical soldiers, directly formed a giant metal sword filled with explosive light and shadows in the hand of the blurry figure. At the same time, in the space inside the giant sword, holy light surged. The vast vitality completely enveloped the giant sword and the blurry figure, greatly speeding up the process of their return. Except for one finger, the mechanical giant had been completely devoured. The vast mechanical army had completely turned into nothingness. The sea of chaos had also disappeared. Xianyuan Wushang Saint and Xingtian were still inside the space of the giant sword. The giant sword's blade was held in an extremely clear and real hand. The light continued to spread and condense around the two of them. He held the sword and slowly walked out of the holy light. In the weak light in the void, it was Lin Shi's extremely calm face. The 8th level of martial arts authority. The bloody Azura. And in the 3 camps, all living beings liked to boast that they were immortals. Or rather, they were called the Undying Azura. Chapter 1136. Compared to Heaven's End, Azura's core authority was undoubtedly the most attractive among all the authorities. It was a complete sublimation compared to Heaven's End authority. Replication targeted the opponent. Azura, on the other hand, completely replicated his own life force. To put it simply, it was resurrection. At the 8th level of authority, the Shura had already begun to temper his divine form. Every divine form could be said to be an extra life for the Shura. The empty and quiet battlefield didn't turn into a black hole under the huge energy impact. The vast and endless mechanical army was completely destroyed. Xingtian completely lost the ability to fight. The Apostle's thought clone had returned. Before his thought clone returned to the battlefield to summon the mechanical army again, the only one qualified to face Worryless head-on was Lin Shi. Saint and Xianyuan Wushang could provide protection for him. Similarly, he also had to provide protection for Saint and Xianyuan Wushang. Worryless stood in the void, his somewhat illusory face silently looking at Lin Shi. His fluctuating aura calmed down again. Compared to before, he was a little weaker, but this shadow in the void still had a sharpness that could tear everything apart. Lin Shi subconsciously grasped the giant mechanical sword in his hand. Endless destructive energy surged on the blade of the giant mechanical sword, bringing with it waves of continuous explosions. As the blade trembled slightly, the void seemed to shatter and distort in the seemingly tiny explosions. The moment these tiny black holes appeared, they were neutralized by another kind of explosive energy. All kinds of energy gathered in the explosions, and the giant sword formed by the countless mechanical army became more and more terrifying. Lin Shi's eyes were a little dazed. To be precise, Worryless was a part of King Wei who was seriously injured and almost completely crippled. In addition, His Majesty's divine form had almost completely dissipated. Worryless was in an extremely bad state. This could be seen from the strength he displayed. He didn't even reach the level 8 authority that they had expected. He was only infinitely close. Worryless didn't even clearly display any specific authority. What he displayed was the purest form of martial arts. The extreme combination of power and speed brought absolute lethality and destruction. This was the essence of martial arts. But how many people in the neutral camp could do this? This was the goal that most peak figures pursued, such as his father, grandfather, and His Majesty in the corridor of time and space. This was an instinct and battle experience that had been honed over a long period of time. In this state, even if his authority level was slightly lower, in a situation where he didn't have an absolute advantage, this kind of experience was enough to allow him to crush his opponent. At this moment, Wu Yu could no longer use chaotic C. On the other hand, Lin Shi had to face Wu Yu, who was in a weakened state, but his battle awareness wasn't affected at all. This was the conclusion of this battle. Perhaps he could find many excuses such as insufficient preparation, or a huge mistake in the intelligence report, or an incorrect estimation of the state of the half-divine form, or that the apostle still had many trump cards that he had yet to use. There are many excuses. But there was only one reality. They had lost. 1 peak apostle, 1 Azura, 2 holy apostles, and 1 calligrapher. The few of them worked together, but they lost to a part of King Wei's core and half a divine form. This lineup was unexpectedly luxurious, but it also had a huge flaw. This flaw should not have existed. It was because in the anticipated battle, the apostle was the absolute main force. Lin Shi was in charge of support. The 2 holy apostles were in charge of recovery, and Xing Tian rewrote the rules. Everything was perfect. However, that chaotic sea broke everything. The destruction of the mechanical army wasn't the most important thing. The most important thing was that in that void of sword energy that didn't even exist, the apostle's thought clone couldn't escape the edge of chaotic sea. The apostle's thought clone disappeared. The apostle's main body, who had just used ultra-long distance travel, needed time to form another thought clone from this battlefield. This time might not be long, but under this type of situation, it was unacceptably long. In a situation where the apostle's thought clone wasn't here, the holy apostle's combat strength was negligible in front of Wu Yu. Xing Tian didn't have any combat strength. Lin Shi, who also belonged to the martial Dao domain, was almost directly countered by Wu Yu. There was no way he was Wu Yu's opponent. It was to the extent where he couldn't even last until the apostle formed another thought clone here. Based on Wu Yu's current display of strength, Lin Shi could clearly estimate how long it would take for Wu Yu to attack him. How long could he resist Wu Yu for? With the help of the 2 holy apostles, it should be about 15 seconds. In his line of sight, Wu Yu's body moved. An extremely sharp radiance suddenly spread out from his body. The radiance was pitch black at first, and then it instantly turned white. The white then turned black again. The black and white sword energy continuously spread in the void. The space around the battlefield completely distorted, becoming unstable. Space was unstable, so it was naturally impossible to travel ultra-long distances. This further lengthened the time it took for the apostle's thought clone and even his main body to arrive. Lin Shi silently watched all this. He watched the black and white sword energy disappear into the distance and suddenly laughed. This kind of failure is really miserable. At least for me, this is the first time in my life. Within the mechanical sword, Xianyuan Wushang and the holy apostle didn't say anything. Wu Yu didn't say anything either, only quietly looking at him. As expected of the guard king, Lin Shi's expression was serious and respectful. The guard king slowly drifted in the void for some distance. I admit defeat. Lin Shi continued to laugh. But I still have to say you can't leave today. Wu Yu's energy soul fluctuated for a moment, with incomparably cold mockery. You are the cornerstone of the world, and His Majesty is the creator of the neutral camp. No matter what the reason is, as a member of the neutral camp, I must make you and your body whole. Lin Shi raised the sword in his hand. Tiny explosions constantly surged on the huge mechanical sword's edge, destroying space and repairing space at the same time. A sword light that was even darker than the black itself covered the entire sword in strands. Bang! An incomparably dull shattering sound suddenly rang out in the void that should have been silent. Lin Shi's face instantly paled. His aura instantly turned into nothingness. From a biological point of view, he was already dead at this moment. The giant mechanical sword madly trembled. The incomparably deep black suddenly became incomparably solid. Lin Shi's aura instantly became strong again. The moment he raised the sword, he directly shattered one of his divine forms. Without any hesitation, he focused all of his energy and life force into this one strike. Lin Shi directly died and then relied on another divine form to instantly revive. He only had 3 divine forms. He cloned one of the superluminal sword strikes. Another one was shattered. Now this was the last one. An Azura without a divine form meant that he was infinitely close to death. Wu Yu's figure stiffened for a moment. He carefully sensed the sword intent on the opponent's giant mechanical sword. That sword intent was not very powerful, but in his perception, it had an absolutely strong target, so that he felt an extremely huge threat. Lin Shi raised the giant sword in his hand little by little. On the sword edge, the pitch-black sword intent began to boil violently. Lin Shi's double pupils moved, and he laughed extremely crazily and extremely gently. "Your Highness, I'm not afraid of death. Are you?" In Wu Yu's increasingly tensed body, the giant mechanical sword slowly fell. "Divine form, natural enemy. Please enlighten me, Your Highness." The boiling black sword energy instantly spread. Wu Yu's figure flickered at the same time. The sharp sword light that surpassed the speed of light instantly lit up and then disappeared. Lin Shi did not respond. In front of this extreme speed, he had no time to react. The dazzling sword light directly tore the black sword energy, and then tore Lin Shi's giant sword and body. Destruction. Shenyuan Wushang Xingtian Saint Lin Shi. The sword light swept through every person, every part, every inch of the void. Everything was completely destroyed in an instant. There was no flying flesh and blood. The sword light that surpassed the speed of light swept through, and all the breath of life disappeared. Shenyuan Wushang died. Lin Shi died. Xingtian and Saint died at the same time. This time Lin Shi, who had no divine form, had no chance of resurrection. And Shenyuan Wushang and the others also had no chance of resurrection. The battlefield was empty. Only Wu Yu's body was left. And the torn black sword energy. The deep and profound black sword energy directly enveloped Wu Yu's body in the torn state, and then instantly condensed. Divine form, natural enemy. The moment he was enveloped by the sword energy, Wu Yu had already understood the characteristics of this divine form. The natural enemy was just a prototype. But this was a figure that absolutely emphasized single-target lethality and penetration. The sword energy of the natural enemy was not sharp, but it could forcibly create a fatal weakness on the enemy. In the spread of the sword energy, this figure had a frequency of hitting the weakness, and it could cause a fatal attack the moment it hit. This was just a prototype. There were too many possibilities for him to develop and perfect in the future. But these no longer existed now. Because Lin Shi had died. The black sword energy penetrated the layers of protection that Wu Yu had set up, and with the nature that was higher than Wu Yu's authority, it directly hit his figure. Boundless energy instantly spread out in the void. The intensity of Wu Yu's aura plummeted. His body, which had been straight all the time, bent and became weak in a few seconds. But it did not matter. The overflowing cosmic radiation began to madly gather towards him again. There was no one on the battlefield. All the opponents had died. He was free. Chapter 1137. Some were happy, some were tired. Some were melancholy, some were lonely. The feeling of comfort swept through his will after the various strange emotions. He could no longer remember the feelings from a long time ago. A long time ago he understood that he was not complete. The flaw of being born with a split made him forget too many things and abandon many things. For example, his strength, the past, and his own responsibility. As a pure energy body, his memory was fundamentally different from that of humans. The so-called memory could also be considered a kind of energy. The scenes of the past were like incomparably deep imprints, completely engraved in the depths of his energy soul. The past had long been forgotten, but those still somewhat blurry images still flashed from time to time. His consciousness awakened in the most chaotic state and became more and more active. The images that were like imprints carved in his soul also became more and more active. King Wei. He vaguely felt that this title was very familiar, but he was not willing to think about it carefully. It was as if it was instinctive. He rejected accepting the past, didn't want to recall, didn't want to think, and was too lazy to participate. He had long forgotten the power and responsibility that this identity represented. Forget it, forget it. That wasn't a bad thing. He still couldn't clearly understand what the images that flashed in his soul from time to time meant. They were like blurry and unclear stories. He stood outside the scene and watched quietly. He didn't hate those stories, nor did he dislike them. He didn't have any resentment in his heart. The images kept flipping in his soul. One story after another. Every time the images flashed, he only felt exhaustion. It was a kind of exhaustion that came from the soul. Those countless things that he had long forgotten, but they were the things that he had once carried on his back. He couldn't relax, he couldn't rest, and he couldn't relax. He was almost numb as he held on. He didn't dislike that feeling. But there was a kind of instinctive fear. He was afraid of that feeling. He felt that he should have his own experience, his own story, and his own emotions. He shouldn't carry those things and become an unattainable and simple symbol in everyone's eyes. He longed for freedom. He longed for rest. He longed for no longer belonging to anyone. He longed for life. He finally had the chance. In his heavily injured state, he was actually moved to this void far away from the place where he used to hibernate. This was an opportunity that he had dreamed of for a long time. There was no possibility of his injuries recovering in that manner. They would only get worse. He longed to enter the void. The endless cosmic radiation in the void could restore a certain degree of his combat power in the shortest time possible. This was the greatest guarantee for freedom. The great general of Wei country, the deputy commander of the guards, 2 princes, and that calligrapher, worryless, recalled the opponent he had just met. In his intuition, the apostle still had a bit of room for improvement. Even though this space was already extremely small, it still existed. The potential of a saint was not very great, but he could probably take 1 or 2 more steps forward. The big man who had not spoken from beginning to end seemed to be very interesting. He should be in a state of recovery, but it seemed that he had suffered too many fatal injuries in the distant past, and even his body was somewhat incomplete. His road of recovery would be extremely rough, but his potential was incomparably huge, and it was even possible for him to set foot on the peak level. Xianyuan Wushang, who called him Uncle Wei Wang. The space-time corridor was very familiar, and this prince of the space-time corridor also seemed somewhat familiar. A long time ago they should have known each other. The authority that he exposed was that of a holy disciple, but there should be another neutral authority hidden in the dark. With that neutral authority he would almost certainly be able to reach the peak level. He just needed time. Then there was Lin Shi. He had never heard of this name. And he had never heard of the God of War realm. More importantly, he could not see through Lin Shi. Lin Shi's state was extremely strange. His whole body seemed to be shrouded in a thin layer of mist, and his fate node was blurred and he could not see through it. Especially the last sword move, the divine natural enemy, gave him a very ancient but inexplicable sense of familiarity. And now, they were all dead. These people were undoubtedly extremely important figures in their own camp, especially Lin Shi. Especially Lin Shi. If he continued to grow, no one knew what heights he would reach. But now they were all dead. Everything had become no longer important. All of this might have deviated from the responsibility that he had originally carried. But it was no longer important. After the fierce battle, the battlefield was dead silent and clean. The mechanical army that covered the starry sky, the broken flesh and blood, the floating dust, the flying sword light, everything had completely disappeared. Worryless floated quietly in the void, and his will fluctuated slightly. In the blink of an eye, the scenes of the battle just now began to fade from his memory. As time passed, all the memories of this battle would be sealed or even completely disappear. He began to check his own state. His current state was not good, and it could even be said to be extremely poor. Every apostle in the neutral camp could be said to have the combat power of a trump card. Although they had never set foot on the peak, when they used their full strength, even those who had just entered the peak level would feel a headache. The authority of the number 1 destructive power under the starry sky was enough to make anyone take them seriously. The apostle next to Lin Shi was also a peak apostle, the kind closest to the peak level, and also the limit of this authority that humans could reach. Worryless had no choice. His memory had long been blurred, but the horror of the scholar authority had long been engraved in his soul. In his current state, under the suppression of the other party's authority, he had almost no chance of winning. There was no possibility. Which apostle in the neutral camp did not have a lot of tricks. Moreover, this was a peak apostle. The mighty mechanical army that covered the void looked indeed terrifying, but in fact, it could not even be considered a warm-up. The other party undoubtedly wanted to use this batch of cannon fodder that was about to be eliminated to consume his energy. The next move would be the real trump card. Therefore, Worryless did not hesitate and directly used the half-divine form in his energy core. The half-form of the Sea of Chaos, including the Apostle's thought clone, instantly destroyed the entire mechanical army. The Apostle left the battlefield. Worryless also paid the price of losing nearly half of his energy. In this state he had taken Lin Shi's predator head-on, so he had no choice. He could not see Lin Shi clearly, so naturally he could not see Lin Shi's divine form. This divine form followed the rules of the world, leaned towards order, and carried a power that would inevitably hit and maximize the weakness of his existence. In order to temporarily increase his power, Lin Shi even shattered his other divine form. This sword could also be said to be a clear suppression of authority. Lin Shi's ending was very tragic, and there was no possibility of him being resurrected. The same was true for Xianyuan Wushang. Their deaths made Worryless directly return to the level of less than level 5 authority. The price was heavy, but in the end he still won. Freedom, rest, life, all kinds of thoughts continuously spun in his mind. He wanted to leave this place. The world was very big and there were countless star fields and endless galaxies. He could go to a place outside the boundary of the space-time corridor and become an ordinary energy life form, hiding in a corner where the master of his main body and divine form could not find him. He could start over with a level 5 authority and set foot on the peak. At that time he would truly obtain freedom. The apostle's body moved as if he was taking a deep breath. The cosmic radiation from all directions began to crazily gather toward him. He instinctively wanted to take a step forward and then leave this area. However, his movements suddenly stopped. He did not know where to go. Thinking of the words Lin Shi had said before his death, the energy all over Worryless' body fluctuated continuously, as if he was thinking. He already could not remember his own identity, but he could understand what those things that made him extremely tired meant. It was responsibility and it was also power. Whether from the perspective of personal grievances or the overall situation, the so-called space-time corridor and the war god realm should not have let him leave so easily. At this time, there might be countless eyes gathered here, and the forces behind them should not have let them die. Was it too far to rush over? The possibility was too small. Or was the reinforcements already on the way? If that was the case, if he left now and chose the wrong direction, he might plunge into the encirclement of countless armies. Or, now he was surrounded by a circle of people. Worryless' body froze in the void, motionless. Chapter 1138. Actually, Worryless' thoughts were not unreasonable. Worryless' existence was related to whether or not King Wei would be able to return in one piece. Thus, when the battle began, this battlefield attracted the attention of countless important figures in the space-time corridor. The heaven-deceiving king was the most powerful person in the space-time corridor, and he was at the same level as Princess Royal Feng Qinggu. This was the rear of the space-time corridor, surrounded by Miracle City, and there was also a sword array set up by the 3 most powerful people of the neutral camp. Under such circumstances, it was undoubtedly the most suitable to have a ruler here. Even if the peak experts of the Order or Shadow Camp could bypass the front line of the space-time corridor and launch a surprise attack on the spinning galaxy, a ruler would be able to deal with them. Even if the ruler failed, he could still deceive the distance between the stars in an instant, causing the sword array outside Miracle City to appear in front of him in an instant, destroying everything in his way. At the same time, he could also let the strongest experts of the 3 camps receive the news. The Heaven Deceiver wanted to intervene right from the start of the battle. The spiraling galaxy was a medium to large-sized star region and it was quite far away. However, apostles could teleport over extremely long distances, and as a ruler he could also manipulate distance, turning trillions of light years into a few steps, and thus directly entering the battlefield. However, just as he moved, he was stopped. The order came from His Majesty of the Space-Time Corridor, Great Emperor Xianyuan. The Great Emperor didn't explain the reason. Instead, he projected a consciousness next to him and watched the battle silently. The King of Deception had no idea what the Great Monarch was waiting for, so he could only suppress his anxiety. The King of Deception had a lot of complaints about the young men attacking Worryless after a brief discussion. He wanted to complain, but he couldn't. After all, Worryless was a part of King Wei and half of His Majesty's divine form. No matter how weak Worryless' condition was, Worryless was not someone they could deal with. If they were in the God of War's realm, it wouldn't be so bad. After all, the headquarters of the Peak Apostles was in the God of War's realm. However, they were in the space-time corridor and the Apostles' combat power was limited. In King of Deception's eyes, they had no chance of success. It was the same during the battle. They might have caused some trouble for Wu Yu. However, the entire battle could be said to be completely one-sided. Sword chi that surpassed the speed of light. The catastrophe. The scene that had been separated from the starry sky for a long time once again appeared under the starry sky. The King of Deception was excited but at the same time worried. Then he saw the predator. This is heaven-deceiving King's pupils constricted. This divine form. The divine form nemesis. The light of the sword was imprinted in his eyes, and it was replayed thousands of times in an instant. Familiar. It was incomparably familiar. Unfamiliar. It was also incomparably unfamiliar. The heaven-deceiving king was a little confused. He was sure that he had seen this sword before, or a sword similar to it, but he couldn't remember what it meant. That familiar feeling was too faint. And that unfamiliar feeling was incomparably strong. The heaven-deceiving king hesitated for a moment before asking, "Who is he?" Of course he was referring to Lin Shi. In the war god realm, Lin Shi was almost universally recognized as the successor of the war god. He could even be said to be the crown prince of the war god realm. Although the war god rarely mentioned this identity in recent years, Lin Shi was still dazzling enough. However, as the 11th prince who had once been favored by the god of war, Lin Shi kept a low profile most of the time and rarely appeared in public. The people in the space-time corridor knew very little about him and they had never seen him fight. But looking at the godly figure before him, looking at that sword, the King of Deception was getting more and more dazed. He hesitated for a moment and asked again, "Your Majesty, is Lin Shi really the son of the war god?" In terms of blood relations, yes. The projection of the great emperor was shrouded in golden light. His voice was extremely calm. In terms of blood relations, yes. Then what about the real relationship? The heaven-deceiving king wanted to ask more. The great emperor suddenly sighed and smiled. "You guys are really good at hiding things. If I hadn't been watching this sword, even if I knew there was something wrong with Lin Shi, I wouldn't have thought he was." The great emperor paused and shook his head. Time was meaningless. Only a few minutes had passed on the battlefield, but a few days had passed here. On the battlefield, Worryless stood quietly. Lin Shi and Xianyuan Wushang had both died. The great emperor had been extremely calm the whole time, waiting quietly. It wasn't until he sighed that two ink-black light spots quietly appeared beside the great emperor. The light spots kept expanding and shrinking, and once again became two extremely blurry remote projections. The heaven-deceiving king narrowed his eyes, smiled and said calmly, "Your Majesties. The human sovereign of the human palace. The war god of the war god realm." The moment the two of them appeared, the heaven-deceiving king seemed to have completely forgotten that Xianyuan Wushang and Lin Shi had died. He was completely calm. "When did you find out?" The black figure slightly twisted. The remote projection of the human emperor spoke slowly. His voice was calm and ethereal as if it had passed through endless time and space, with a sense of unreality. The two deep black projections formed a blurry figure on the left and right sides of the great emperor. "Very early," the great emperor said calmly. "When I first saw him, I felt something was wrong, but I couldn't tell what was wrong. This state of his is no longer a return but a complete rebirth. I should have found out long ago, but you hit him too deeply. Shouldn't you explain this matter?" "What explanation do you want?" The voice of the war god who was fighting in the corridor of time and space was clear and tough. The great emperor Xianyuan was silent for a moment. Then he said calmly, "Is it because you don't trust me? Or because you don't trust His Majesty? Or because you don't trust the entire corridor of time and space?" His Majesty Huangxi is coming back. The war god said calmly, 11 is my son, of course I have to hide him well. Who knows what His Majesty's attitude is? Or do you hope that when he comes back the war god's realm will break with the corridor of time and space? The great Emperor Xianyuan smiled and his voice was a little bitter. I don't remember clearly what happened in the past, but His Majesty Li Tianlan also regrets it. But you should know his character indirectly. Even if he regrets, he won't admit it. The war god and the human emperor didn't speak. The first His Majesty was in charge of the human clan and the entire neutral camp. Not to mention at that time, even now with his strength, he could be said to be the well-deserved #1 expert of the neutral camp. At the same time, he was also a rare tyrant. No one could deny his achievements, but his mistakes could not be covered up either. Lin Shi could be said to be the biggest mistake that His Majesty made since he took control of the human clan. Whether it was Huangxi or Li Tianlan. In the beginning, the great Emperor Xianyuan could be said to be the first His Majesty's student. And Lin Shi's predecessor could be said to be the great Emperor Xuanyuan's junior brother. The two of them were the most likely to take over that His Majesty's authority. If the Order Camp didn't sow discord, today's corridor of time and space might be different. The Order Camp's method was simple yet not simple. They used the tactic of sowing discord that had happened countless times in the history of the human clan. But the other party did it very cleverly, and all the details seemed almost flawless at that time. At that time, all the evidence seemed to indicate that the great Emperor Xuanyuan's junior brother wanted to blaspheme his master's wife. That was the first His Majesty's wife, the current Qin Weibai. But in fact, the great Emperor Xianyuan knew very well that the little junior brother fell in love with the first His Majesty's daughter. That was the current Feng Qinggu. The Order Camp successfully understood the relationship between the master and the disciple. In the beginning, His Majesty didn't fall for the trap, but some grudges were inevitable. Feeling the alienation from his teacher and the strange gazes from all sides, little junior brother's fate was inadvertently changed by the Order faction's strongest individual in his despair. That was why he did the most foolish thing in his life. In order to prove his innocence, he borrowed a sword from the great Emperor Xianyuan. With that sword as the edge and the infinite destiny of the human clan as the light, the endless sharp edge injured Qin Weibai in an instant from an extremely far distance. Now it was already impossible to understand how all this happened, let alone how seriously injuring Qin Weibai could prove his innocence. Maybe the situation developed like this at that time, or maybe the fate node was changed. The process was vague, but in fact it was no longer important. The important thing was the consequences. Qin Weibai's daughter, Feng Qinggu, bewitched the little junior brother with a doppelganger. He might have seen through the doppelganger long ago, but he didn't care. Instead, he cherished it very much. Only a few people knew that the person he really fell in love with was Feng Qinggu. Even if it was just a doppelganger, he was addicted to it and couldn't extricate himself. That doppelganger was now a household name in the history of Miracle City, and its real name was Enchantress. She was so beautiful that she could cause the downfall of a country and bring disaster to the people. Everything happened naturally and smoothly. At that time, the little junior brother who controlled the human clan of Miracle City could be said to be obedient to Feng Qingwu's enchantress doppelganger, and he couldn't allow her to suffer any grievances. Killing the officials, imposing torture, desolate silver. During that time, the destiny of the human clan rapidly flowed away and shifted to other human clans. The Order Camp took advantage of the situation and changed the fate of the entire Miracle City, transforming the destiny of the human clan into destiny, and then used eternal life as a temptation, causing internal strife within the human clan of Miracle City. The influence of the civil strife continued to increase, and finally affected the entire neutral camp. Chaos suddenly arose and there was a lot of disturbance. It was a chaotic, short, and extremely long period of time. When the first His Majesty realized everything, the big mistake had already been made. He personally took action and killed the little junior brother with a sword, but in the face of chaos he was already powerless. The Miracle City changed owners. A large number of human clan experts were branded with the mark of order, and then joined the Order Camp, completely betraying the neutral camp. The first His Majesty invited the human clan of the universe to station in the west of Miracle City to stabilize the situation. In order to recapture Miracle City, he fought with countless peak experts of the Order Camp. The destiny of the human clan of Miracle City was exhausted, and the destiny of the Order Camp also began to fall apart. The neutral camp finally recaptured Miracle City, but the seriously injured His Majesty was no longer able to gather the destiny of the human clan. The internal injuries continued to accumulate. In the following years His Majesty took action many times and finally fell under the siege. Qin Weibai left with him. The authority was concentrated on Great Emperor Xianyuan. Great Emperor Xianyuan moved Miracle City, and in order to erase the destiny left by the Order Camp, he used sword energy to seal the time and space around Miracle City. It was not until a few hundred years ago in real time that the so-called destiny of Miracle City completely dissipated, and the destiny of the human clan began to return. Great Emperor Xuanyun's thoughts were a little absent-minded and he muttered to himself, "I regret that I should have. This matter is a misunderstanding and now you should be clear that this has long become a taboo. You can rest assured that even if His Majesty returns he will not pursue this matter. It was originally a plot by the Order Camp to sow discord, and there is no need to pursue it." After a pause he smiled and said, "And the ill-fated relationship between the little junior brother and Qinggu must have been enough to give His Majesty a headache." "I know." God of War was silent for a while. "That's why I arranged for him to go to Miracle City." "You mean?" Great Emperor's tone was slightly raised. "His return this time is purely instinctive. At this point it can be considered a complete failure. The sword of the natural enemy has become a divine form, which will greatly limit his future development. He can't care about the fate with Feng Qinggu now and he needs to start again. In fact, the failure of his return is not a surprise, but the most important thing is that his failure is too ridiculous. I suspect that this should have something to do with Her Majesty Huangshi personally killing him back then. His soul is stained with the real mark of Her Majesty and that divine form. 9 deaths. Great Emperor's voice was calm. Back then the little junior brother was killed by the divine form 9 deaths. To some extent he witnessed it with his own eyes and wanted to stop it, but was unable to do so. So start again, let His Majesty end him again and then return again. God of War said. That's good. The Great Emperor pondered for a moment before nodding. You seem to have forgotten that Lin Shi is already dead, and there is no chance for him to be resurrected. The heaven-deceiving king suddenly reminded with a chuckle. He who had been silent, finally confirmed Lin Shi's identity. After confirming Lin Shi's identity, he naturally knew why he was so familiar with that divine form. The divine form natural enemy. This sword was the one he had used to severely injure Qin Weibai. What is life and death? God of War asked indifferently. King of Deception snorted and said calmly, if you want to do it then hurry up. A long night is fraught with trouble and King Wei should be more complete now. I'm here so there is no such thing as a long night is fraught with trouble. Human Emperor's calm voice sounded. His sight crossed the endless distance and fell on the battlefield where only Worryless was left. In an instant he had seen Worryless state clearly. I'm curious about what he's thinking now. God of War suddenly said. He wants freedom. Great Emperor Xianyuan said slowly. He is different from the polluted Worryless. Worryless is the core. After being polluted, his position is equivalent to betrayal. This kind of betrayal is unconscious. He instinctively refuses to merge with the body and even wants to devour the body. If he can succeed, then King Wei will join the shadow camp. Worryless is more complicated. To some extent, he is the combination of His Majesty's figure, his long-term negative emotions, deep memories and part of energy. With that divine form, there is no possibility of him being polluted, but the negative emotions accumulated in King Wei's long life will affect him and make him instinctively avoid responsibility. He won't betray, but he doesn't want to carry anything. All he wants is freedom. Now we dare not let Wuqing and Worryless merge. Wuqing's loyalty to His Majesty is instinctive, but none of us dare to underestimate the shadow camp. Therefore the most correct way is to let Worryless and Wuqing merge first. Let Wuqing digest the negative emotions that belong to him. That way, after the body and the divine form merge, Wuqing won't be afraid of being polluted. Then when Worryless fuses, the divine form will turn the pollution of the shadow camp into pure nothingness. When King Wei's body becomes complete, that is the real period of cultivation and also the starting point of his return. God of War nodded. Then let's begin. Without a sound, God of War's projection disappeared. With a flash of golden light, Great Emperor Xianyuan left the spinning galaxy. Human Emperor's projection directly dissipated and returned to another time and space. King of Deception was still watching the battlefield quietly. He saw worryless on the battlefield and suddenly looked up at the dead void around him. His body tensed up as if he had encountered a great threat, with indescribable anger. In silence, the void around the battlefield suddenly began to twist. The rule of space was changed beyond recognition by the mighty sword intent. The twisted space began to shatter without a sound. Worryless raised his hand. The sword light burst out from his hand, extremely dazzling. It was a beautiful scene. But it was slow. Too slow. The sword light in his hand slowly bloomed in an almost frozen state. That was actually still extremely fast. But as the void shattered, the rule of time on the battlefield also changed beyond recognition. King of Deception watched quietly. He could feel the vast sharpness that had suddenly appeared in the silent void. It was dark, deep, and boundless. That was the sword light that burst out to the extreme. That was a sword that directly tore through time and space from an endless distance. That was the sword of human emperor. The sword light rushed out from another time and space, endless and perfect. Time and space completely surrendered to the will of the sword light. So the broken time began to reassemble. Time began to change. Worryless took a step back. He retracted his raised hand. Then Worryless took another step back. The sword light suddenly appeared around him and was all compressed back into his energy body. The natural enemy of the divine form began to appear. The huge mechanical sword gradually became clear. The sword edge was pulled out from Worryless' energy body bit by bit. The divine form was completely clear. Lin Shi's figure was outlined bit by bit from the void, then quickly retreated. The dark sword energy on the mechanical sword was extinguished. The huge sword turned into a finger. The finger began to touch the necklace. The sea of chaos that could turn everything into nothingness appeared again. The outline of the mechanical giant became clear. Seemed to be boundless and crazy, shrinking, getting smaller and smaller. The mechanical giant disintegrated again. The endless mechanical army that covered the starry sky began to appear. The sea of chaos disappeared. The mechanical army began to retreat. Then formed a huge metal planet. The metal planet disintegrated and once again turned into a mechanical army that covered the sky. Endless flames and sword light suddenly lit up, but they did not collide. Instead, they kept retreating in the direction from which they came. The shadow of the metal planet began to appear. The mechanical army all entered the shadow of the planet. The apostle snapped his fingers. Worryless' figure kept moving and finally moved to a distant place. A large amount of space dust began to float on the battlefield. The apostle's first voice resounded in the void. This was the beginning of the battle and also the end of the battle. War God Realm's great General Wei, Duke Wei, Apostle Lin Wuxiang, greets your highness King Wei. Everything stopped. Time and space became stable again. Lin Shi, Shenyuan Wuxiang, Apostle Saint Xingtian. Everyone stood under the starry sky again. Everyone had returned to their peak state before the battle began. Except for Worryless. Right now he was still in the weakest state after the battle. In that vast black sword light, time and space became an individual, constantly flowing backward, interfering with the individual but not the reality. Now that they were at their peak, facing a weak Worryless who had not even reached the 5th level of authority, there was no need to continue the battle. This was not resurrection. It was time backtracking on an individual level. To be more precise, this was a reincarnation. Chapter 1139. Time was meaningless. A few minutes had passed on the battlefield at the edge of the rotating Milky Way. A few years had passed in the hall of the King of Deception in the center of the Milky Way, but only a few seconds had passed in the real time of Miracle City. Li Tianlong slowly breathed out. In his perception, Ruthless stood quietly in the lounge of the interrogation room, confused, quiet and silent like a statue. Zhou Mulin had taken out his mobile phone and was ready to call the emergency number. The interrogation that lasted for a day was interrupted by Li Tianlong's abnormality at the most critical moment. Although he said that he was fine, no one thought that bleeding from the 7 apertures was the so-called fine. Li Tianlong must not die. This was the consensus of Zhongzhou's state. Everyone was afraid of him, but they had to rely on him to balance the situation of Zhongzhou's state and even the entire dark world. Except for extreme cases like Qin Fangqing, there were few high-level people in Zhongzhou state who wanted to kill Li Tianlong. Now Guo Wentin might be half of them, but most people agreed with Li Huaqing's idea. Li Tianlan could have his own forces and groups, but everything about him must be contained to a certain extent, so that Li Tianlan and Zhongzhou state could achieve a so-called win-win situation. Li Huaqing did not mind giving Li Tianlan great power and benefits, but the premise was that Li Tianlan should really become a part of Zhongzhou state. Perhaps the miserable end of the Li family had long been deep in Li Tianlan's soul, so what Li Huaqing hoped was not what Li Tianlan wanted. He wanted to become another Wang family of Beihai, which was beneficial to Zhongzhou state, but maintained a high degree of autonomy. He could keep in line with Zhongzhou state in terms of position, but to be more precise, the relationship between Emperor Dong's palace and Zhongzhou state should be more cooperative than subordinate. All the contradictions between Li Tianlan and Li Huaqing were the collision of these two ideas. This did not seem to be a big difference, but at some subtle moments it could play a decisive role. Not to mention anything else, more than 20 years ago, if it was the Wang family of Beihai that suffered a catastrophe instead of the Li family, everything the Wang family of Beihai had suffered would definitely be countless times better than the Li family. What the Li family had encountered was not the most miserable. After all, Li Honghe was still alive, so the Li family still had its afterglow. And if this thing happened to the Wang family of Beihai, their worst ending was that the Beihai core and the supreme power of Beihai province would change hands. The Wang family of Beihai would still be the top wealthy family in Zhongzhou state and even in the world. Blood mixed with cold water droplets flowed down from his fingers. Li Tianlan leaned back on the rocking chair in the shadow again. The chair shook slightly. Li Tianlan glanced at Zhou Xian, who was standing in the center of the conference room, and said in a steady voice, "Go on." There was a brief silence in the conference room. In the conference room, the girl, who was still a little childish but vaguely had a peerless elegance, cast a curious glance in Li Tianlan's direction. Regardless of the psychological activities of the giants present, she went on directly. As a student that Gu Xingyun had devoted countless efforts to in the past few years. What Gu Xianyan displayed was an absolutely complete and authentic Phoenix Pavilion. Even the dark side of the entire Kunlun city. The conference room was filled with a gloomy atmosphere. Every big shot's expression gradually became gloomy. In the almost frozen atmosphere, only the girl's crisp and cold voice continued to speak. The rocking chair swayed slightly. Li Tianlan's eyes seemed to lose focus. Gu Xinyan's voice sounded intermittently in his consciousness. All of his attention was focused on the nearby Wuqing. The virtual light blue line continued to extend on the edge of worry-free heights. In silence, Lin Shi, Shenyuan Wushang Xing Tian, and Saint reappeared on the edge of worry-free heights. The real body of the apostle stood there silently. Looking at the people who appeared beside him, he fell into silence for a while. "It's terrible." After nearly half a minute, the apostle sighed softly. "If it weren't for His Majesty, even if my real body came to the battlefield, I wouldn't be able to take down worry-free. One of the strongest combat forces of the human clan, even if it's only a weak part, it's not easy to take down." Shenyuan Wushang said in a flat voice. His hands were folded together, and he was holding an extremely dazzling particle of light in an extremely solemn manner. The light particle was very small. If the surrounding light source was removed, its volume could even be said to be non-existent. It rotated unhurriedly on Shenyuan Wushang's palm, emitting a colorful halo, charming and gorgeous. The traces of the void began to fade gradually. The real environment enveloped them. The light particle was immediately affected. The colorful halo began to gradually fade, and the light particle itself began to gradually grow larger and larger. In just a few dozen seconds, a fist-sized stone appeared in Shenyuan Wushang's hand. The multicolored light glimmered faintly on the stone. The apostle only gave it a single look, yet a large amount of information was already directly transmitted into his brain, the countless scenes directly stirring up a violent storm in the depths of his mind. The apostle closed his eyes, releasing a muffled groan, 2 streaks of blood directly flowing out from his eyes. Shenyuan Wushang glanced at him, somewhat admiring him. Worry-free has already recovered to the most primitive state, which is that half-divine form with countless negative emotions. You actually dare to look directly at it. Amazing. The corners of the apostle's mouth twitched, but he didn't say anything. Shenyuan Wushang didn't notice that when he spoke, Lin Shi was also looking directly at the multicolored stone in his hand. His double pupils continuously opened and closed in his eyes. His body trembled a little, but he wasn't injured. I was fortunate to see a part of King Wei's real body. It can be considered a worthwhile trip. Lin Shi said softly, his tone somewhat complicated. This was the first of the 4 great divine weapons of the neutral camp. 3 of the 4 most powerful divine weapons of the neutral camp, if King Wei wasn't included, were in the space-time corridor. This was the foundation of the space-time corridor. This kind of foundation was worthy of the title of the beginning of the human race. The 4th, which was also the first, was now also beginning to return. King Wei, the Thousand World Map, the Human Emperor Tower, and the Xianyuan Sword. These were the 4 great divine weapons that everyone in the neutral camp was familiar with. But in the world, in the major camps, they had a different name. The Sky-Mending Stone, the Thousand World Map, the Human Emperor Tower, and the Xianyuan Sword. There's no need to delay. Worry-free's consciousness has temporarily returned to nothingness. Right now, we need to quickly fuse Worry-free with King Wei's body. Xianyuan Wuxiang looked at Lin Shi. Do you want to watch from the side? No, I can watch from here. Lin Shi shook his head. The apostle's fingers moved slightly, and the figures of Xianyuan Wuxiang and Xing Tian immediately became illusory. The illusory lines spread at the speed of light, and the passage of data directly spread to Serenity Prefecture. The stone in Xianyuan Wuxiang's hand turned into data and instantly disappeared. Chapter 1140. His vision blurred for only a moment. But his body had already crossed thousands of miles. In the completely virtualized hotel room, a large amount of messy data kept combining and quickly formed the bodies of Xianyuan Wuxiang and Xing Tian. The colorful sky-mending stone glowed in his hand. The glimmer seeped out of the hotel room. The light waves formed subtle radiation, constantly spreading in Yuzhou City, forming a special frequency that could not be sensed by any instrument. Xianyuan Wuxiang held the stone solemnly and stood in front of the French window of the hotel with a solemn face. He did not dare to look directly at the sky-mending stone with a lot of negative emotions in his hand. In the corner of his eye, under the colorful light, the fist-sized stone seemed to gradually become transparent. Images with different emotions flickered thousands of times in a second. If one didn't have a special reason or didn't reach the pinnacle level, one's brain would be crushed by the countless images contained in it after a short period of time. Wu Yu's will had disappeared, and the level of the sky-mending stone had returned to the highest level. The colorful light constantly fluctuated in all directions of Yuzhou. Wu Yu's will had been obliterated. The consciousness of the sky-mending stone, which carried half of the divine form and negative emotions, was extremely simple. It felt the existence of the body and instinctively wanted to merge with it. Xianyuan Wuxiang held the stone and waited silently. Your Highness. Xing Tian narrowed his eyes and suddenly called out. Xianyuan Wuxiang did not move and said calmly, Speak. If King Wei has this divine form, will he be able to find Jiang Shangyu without His Majesty's special vision? Xing Tian asked slowly. There were not many records about the divine form catastrophe in the corridor of time and space. The existence of the chaotic sea was one of the few materials about it. It was said that Her Majesty Huang Shi faced the end of the order camp before she reached the peak. In a desperate situation, she condensed the last divine form and became the first god of slaughter of the neutral camp. Under the starry sky, the real peak end of the world could restrain everything, especially martial arts. The catastrophe that Her Majesty Huang Shi condensed in the most desperate and dangerous situation could restrain the end of the world. This could be seen from the battle between Wu Yu and the Apostle. The existence of the catastrophe had also directly established the path of all warriors in the future. Today's war god, today's Ren Huang, today's martial emperor, today's peak of all martial arts levels, were all affected by this train of thought. In Her Majesty Huang Shi's body, the final catastrophe that condensed might not be the strongest, but it was the most crucial. It was the foundation and pillar of martial arts authority, and also Her Majesty Huang Shi's killing intent and hostility. The hostility and murderous intent towards order and the shadow. Right now, the heaven-mending stone state was not complete, and its divine form was only half complete. However, the essence of its existence would not change at all. This was still the Emperor's killing intent and hostility. If King Wei successfully merged with the divine stone and used the hostility of the divine form, it was entirely possible for him to directly locate Jiang Shangyu. What else? Xianyuan Wuxiang looked at Xing Tian in confusion. Why do you think we spent so much effort to erase Wu You's will? It's important for King Wei to be whole again, but finding that hidden rat is even more important. Should we go watch the battle? Xing Tian asked directly. Xianyuan Wuxiang thought for a moment, then shook his head. But we'll stay here. But we can't be sure what state King Wei will be after the fusion. Xing Tian frowned. Of course, it's the true state of Miracle City. Xianyuan Wuxiang's voice was calm and indifferent. Are you sure, Your Highness? Xing Tian's tone became more and more hesitant. Of course. Xianyuan Wuxiang smiled. In fact, it doesn't matter. What matters is that we can be sure of the state of Jiangshangyu or the thing in Jiangshangyu. It can silently pollute the core of King Wei. Needless to say, it must be at the peak level. Standing at that height, even if it was seriously injured and dying, as long as it still had a trace of consciousness, it could easily destroy Miracle City. Father has hidden Miracle City for so many years, and Order and the Shadow have been searching for its location. That thing is now in Miracle City. If it could take action, there would be no need for us to do anything now. There are only two possibilities for its state. First, it's unconscious. It can only affect a small number of people or things around it with some of its aura. This is also the state we are most worried about. If it's in this state, if we take action on the battlefield, it will be easy to wake it up. At that time, our authority will directly become nutrients for it to wake up. Second, it's in an irregular state of chaos. It can also affect people or things around it with its aura, but it won't have a clear consciousness. Its target and environment are completely random. In this state, we can't do anything when we arrive at the scene. It won't be hurt at all. Its only fear is reality. This is something we don't have. King Wei's true state can hurt it to a certain extent. If we add Big Brother, we may even directly kill it. And given the strength of King Wei's true state, no matter what state it is in, it can't attract its attention. When we are asleep, we won't notice a few particles of dust floating in the air. No matter how loud they are, it doesn't mean anything to us. Similarly, when we are in a state of chaos, we won't pay attention to what makes a certain particle of dust in the air different. We are dust, so is King Wei, and so is Jiangshangyu. If King Wei can kill Jiangshangyu, the thing on Jiangshangyu will be exposed as soon as possible. At that time, he will be greeted by the sword formation set up by the three supreme masters of the neutral camp in the outer space of Miracle City. No matter what state he is in, he can only die. We can solve all the trouble once and for all. What if Jiangshangyu doesn't die? Xing Tian asked in a low voice. This possibility was real, because no one knew what the top masters of the shadow camp behind him had done unconsciously. If Jiangshangyu doesn't die, it won't disturb that thing in a special state. If we can't kill him this time, we can kill him next time. Xing Tian stood where he was and was silent for a long time. We can't do anything. Xianyuan Wuxiang held the stone in his hand and let the light spread in his palm. The only thing we can do is to make King Wei complete. So, Xing Tian still didn't speak. No one was sure what was in Jiangshangyu's body. The shadow camp was in an irregular state of chaos everywhere. Among the three camps, they had the least authority. The shadow camp had only one authority. But their authority was also the most comprehensive. It belonged to the shadow camp. It was called Unknown. Chapter 1141. No matter what, this is a very good opportunity. Xianyuan Wuxiang was silent for a long time before he said softly, after all, Jiangshangyu is a big problem. Whether it's from Big Brother's standpoint or the Miracle City's standpoint, he must die. Jiangshangyu's current level was not high. He had come to the space-time corridor's space-time from the War God realm with the Chaos Authority, but his consciousness was always clear. This meant that he had not completely become a shadow creature. But his existence had always been a thorn in the side of the space-time corridor in the War God realm. Even the three majesties who stood at the peak did not ignore his existence. He had always been in the Miracle City, and they could not be sure what state the thing on Jiangshangyu was in. If it were not for this, the space-time corridor and the War God realm would have personally come out to end Jiangshangyu. The space-time corridor's eldest princess Feng Qinggu, who had arrived almost at the same time as Lin Shi, might have taken on this mission to some extent. It was just that there was no good opportunity and a lot of uncertainty, so she did not dare to act rashly. King Wei's fusion was indeed a good opportunity. Ruthlessness and carefree merged into one. Although the core was missing, it was enough to reach the strongest state he had ever been in. In this state, ruthlessness's energy would completely return to its peak state. Its explosive power could be extremely close to the Sword of Eternity that had appeared in the sky above Mormons a few years ago, or it could be completely equal to the power of that sword. The so-called surpassing was no longer possible. In the Miracle City, that sword was already the limit of combat power, and it was also the strongest sword light in the real environment. It was impossible to break this limit even if the power surpassed that sword by a little bit. Of course, the theoretical possibility did exist. First of all, one had to be completely real and have an absolutely clear state of reality. One could get rid of the influence of the real environment in the most realistic environment, and then break through the sword formation of the Miracle City that the three supreme masters of the neutral camp had imprisoned. At the cost of one's own vitality, one could break the limit of reality and surpass that sword light. There were countless possible consequences, but most of them were not good. In this way, rather than saying that one had broken the limit of reality, it was better to say that one used the planet in the real environment as a sword to reconstruct reality. 99% of the results were failure. Even if one succeeded, the Miracle City would be reduced to ashes. Therefore, Mormon's Sword of Eternity was the top single target lethality in the real environment. Even if the god of battle and the great monarchs were to descend in person, that would be the extent of their destructive power. Unless they're not there. He cared about his own safety and didn't care about Miracle City's safety. This was also the reason why the entire neutral camp was extremely afraid of Zhang Xianyu. Zhang Xianyu's body was very likely to be an unknown. The biggest difference between the Shadow faction and the other factions was that they had the highest authority in the faction. All living beings were ants with authority. The unknowns could be said to be the strongest in the Shadow faction. There was no way to guess their combat power. Perhaps in 1 second, the unknowns could surpass all the strongest in the Order faction and the Neutral faction, or even Her Majesty Huangxi. However, in the next second they could become the weakest Shadow faction. The key to this huge change was the state of chaos. None of the peak experts in the Shadow faction were eternal. The unconscious slumber and the irregular chaos were going on all the time. No one could understand the Shadow faction, including the Shadow faction itself. Sometimes they were the strongest faction and sometimes they were the weakest. The Space-Time Cloister and the Order faction still didn't know how many unknowns there were in the Shadow faction. Because of the state of chaos. The Space-Time Cloister had never stopped researching the Shadow faction, but there were countless hypotheses, but there was no strong evidence to prove anything. In the information that Shenyuan Wuxiang had, he could only confirm a small amount of information. It was impossible for every unknowns to always be in their peak state. Could be confirmed. The duration of every unknown's peak state wasn't the same. Could be as long as 10,000 years or as short as a second. Could be confirmed. Every unknowns would fall into a weak state in the state of chaos. The time was random. Could be confirmed. The Shadow faction's authority was above everything else. Doubts. After the unknowns fell into a weak state, the Shadow faction's high-level battle strength wouldn't change. Doubts. After the unknowns fell into a weak state, their authority would be randomly transferred to other individuals. Doubts. There were many combinations of unknowns' abilities. Countless combinations would constantly increase or decrease, chaotic and disorderly. Doubts. There were many unknowns in the Shadow faction. Doubts. There was only one unknowns in the Shadow faction. Doubts. There were no real living beings in the Shadow faction, no real authority, no specific abilities. Authority was the essence and the essence wouldn't change. In the current situation, there were doubts about some research on the Shadow faction, but this theory hadn't been completely eliminated. This meant that these things might be true but they weren't certain. It was because of this uncertainty, but it might be true, that the entire neutral faction was extremely afraid when facing the unknowns, especially when facing the unknowns in Miracle City. If the Shadow faction's authority was the essence and didn't change, then it meant that the thing on Zhang Xianyu's body at this time was at the peak level, but its essence might just be the lowest level of Shadow. The reason why it was powerful was because of the more essential authority. In this state, it wasn't the Shadow creature controlling the authority, but the authority controlling the Shadow creature. It was just a simple carrier. Once he woke up and discovered that this was Miracle City, he could completely sacrifice the life of the carrier to destroy the city. Even if he couldn't completely destroy the city under the sword formation of the three neutral factions' most powerful beings, he could easily bring an unimaginable calamity to the entire Miracle City that would spread across the entire world. and the authority itself could completely rely on the state of chaos to transfer itself to another random shadow creature in another place. In this way it would have almost no losses. Instead it might directly become more powerful. It concerned the entire miracle city and no one dared to gamble. The only way was to make Jiang Shangyu dissipate in the very short time when that thing was separated from Jiang Shangyu at the moment of his death before he could react. Whether the other party was unconscious in a state of deep sleep or in a state of chaos without rules, there was a flaw in the moment it separated from Jiang Shangyu. This flaw existed for a very short period of time. It was even less than 1/10,000th of a second. But this was the only way to deal with it. The great emperor of the spacetime cloister and the god of war realm were now fighting. This task undoubtedly fell on the human emperor of the imperial palace. He was also the most suitable person for this task. His reincarnation could undoubtedly increase the error tolerance of this operation. Xianyuan Wushang didn't know where he was now, but he was sure that His Majesty's gaze was locked on this place at this time, and he could arrive at any time. The colorful eyes of the sky-mending stones spread out. Xianyuan Wushang's eyes quietly became extremely dignified. Only those who knew the inside story could understand how crucial Prince Wei's operation was this time. This battle not only concerned the safety of Miracle City, but also whether His Majesty Li Tianlong could return smoothly. Chapter 1142. Returning was never a simple matter. The higher the level, the greater the danger. Of course, if the level was too low, there was no possibility of returning. The current research results of the time corridor showed that the closer to the peak, the greater the possibility of returning. The core problem here was the ego. To be precise, it was self-awareness. The time corridor had been rebooted countless times. The remnant soul of His Majesty the Emperor personally walked into the world's end. Then it was the King of Guards. Then there were several natural restarts. Returning wasn't a strange thing for most bystanders. But returning was extremely familiar and strange to the returnees. At present, no one could accurately describe the specific nature of returning. It couldn't be said to be a previous life or a reincarnation. To be precise, it should be a certain degree of remodeling. The returnees were remodeled with the true mark and returned to their previous height little by little, even surpassing the past. Their memories would return little by little and their personality would gradually change. Things that they had experienced would become more and more familiar. From the perspective of bystanders, the past was indeed what the returnees had experienced. But for the returnees themselves, the things they recalled weren't what they had experienced. The most important question was, if they returned, who was the returnee? Was it their current self? Or was it their past memories? Or was it something else? Every returnee needed an answer. This was the key to finding self-awareness. If self-awareness was unclear, there would be huge loopholes in the fate node and the will would become the most fatal flaw. This was not the first time such an example happened. There weren't many returnees, but some of them were bewitched by the order camp because they couldn't find a clear self-awareness and became puppets of the order camp. They thought that this world was full of loopholes needed to be repaired, or there was a huge flaw in their will and they were directly killed or even turned into shadow creatures. Or they didn't have a clear self-awareness and completely failed at the moment of returning. There weren't many such examples, but this was only because there weren't many returnees. If it was a specific group of returnees, the proportion wasn't low at all. The reason why they could return was because of the true mark. This was the basic prerequisite for returning. Secondly, it required a real environment. The starry sky was prosperous and lonely. Miracle City wasn't unique and there was more than one similar real environment. In each real environment, there was a returnee who was sprinting towards the peak of the past, whether consciously or unconsciously. The true imprint was the foundation of returning. The real environment was the prerequisite for him to return. When these were fully equipped, what the returnees needed the most was an imprint of themselves. It could also be considered some sort of ritual. The particularity of the real time and the real environment was the greatest capital of the returnees and the most distinct brand after they reshaped their lives. On the way back, everything they experienced in the real environment and the real time would become the clearest and most stable cognitive beacon. If the returnees were unknown in the real environment, they naturally wouldn't form a clear mark. So to put it bluntly, this consciousness wanted the returnees to leave a legend in the real environment so that they would not lose their self-awareness. An invincible legend. Therefore Li Tianlong had to become stronger. This kind of strength was not only his own strength but also his own influence. When the power of Emperor Dong's palace spread all over the world, when Li Tianlan could really reach the level of the Eternal Sword, he could really brand his own legend in the real environment of Miracle City. Then, on the way back to the peak, he could use this clear and real brand to fight against everything he had experienced in the past, and then find a clear self-awareness in his own answer. It's not like there aren't similar examples. Taking Miracle City as an example, the two most obvious examples were the human emperor and the god of war. In a sense, they could also be regarded as returnees. In terms of seniority, they should be about the same as the emperors of the spacetime corridor. However, they had fallen too thoroughly at the beginning, and the human race had lost all information about them after rebooting again and again. No one knew who they used to be, including themselves. Both the human emperor and the god of war left their own legends in the environment of Miracle City. Then, with this imprint, they found their own answers, completely changed their nature, and returned to the peak. The human emperor became the firmament of the human clan. The god of war became the ocean of the human clan. This was the answer that belonged to them. And the legend of Li Tianlan had now begun. It was his time. It was their time. Dong Huang Wu Qing. Except for Qin Weibai, they all needed to rebuild their own imprints in the real environment to fight against the confusion in the process of returning. And there should be no opponents in the legends of Dong Huang and Wu Qing. Wang Tianzong, Li Kuangtu, Jiang Shangyu, Wang Xingxiao, Gu Xingyun. Everyone who stood in front of Li Tianlan had to either surrender or die. And Jiang Shangyu, who was not strong but extremely sensitive, was undoubtedly the most difficult to deal with. His position made the whole neutral camp very careful. Wuting. If Miracle City was destroyed, it was a huge loss for the whole camp. As for Jiang Shangyu himself, it was necessary for Wu Qing and Li Tianlan to kill him. We have carefully analyzed the current situation of Miracle City, especially Zhou State, and made a behavioral assessment of all high-level officials, including Li Huaqing. The error is very small. Xianyuan Wushang suddenly whispered, the high-level officials of Zhou State can be said to be qualified leaders. They may have selfish motives, but people are not saints. On the major issues they have the same position. The environment limits their thinking, but from the perspective of Zhou State, their thinking is actually not wrong. Big Brother's current status has made them feel uneasy and threatened. Emperor Dong's palace is about to lose the power that can balance him in Zhou State, which is what most people don't want to see, especially Li Huaqing. So the parliament needs a person and force that can balance Emperor Dong's palace. Compared with Wang Xingxiao, who is ambiguous, Jiang Shangyu is the most suitable candidate. At some point, Gu Xingyun also needs to be protected temporarily. So if Jiang Shangyu doesn't die at this time, once he has contact with Zhou State, no matter what mistakes he has made. Because of the existence of Emperor Dong's palace, Zhou State will keep him. In this case, the situation will be very complicated at that time. Xing Tian frowned. Yes. Xianyuan Wushang nodded and said, if things come to this point, Big Brother will be in a difficult situation. His combat capability can continue to grow, but the problem is that once Jiang Shangyu really enters Zhou State, he is no longer an enemy from a general standpoint. If Big Brother wants to kill him, what he needs is not only the power to defeat Jiang Shangyu, but also the foundation to fight against the general environment of Zhou State. So it's best to kill him now. Zhou State can't contact or find Jiang Shangyu at present. Once King Wei's body merges with the sky-mending stone, he can directly locate Jiang Shangyu by using the hostility in the catastrophe. Before Zhou State finds Jiang Shangyu and decides his position, his involvement with Phoenix Pavilion and with foreign forces can be defined as a crime. If he is killed, even if Zhou State is angry, it can't say anything on the surface. If Jiang Shangyu can die this time, the neutral camp can breathe a sigh of relief, and there will be no accident that Big Brother will leave his own legend in Miracle City. He has grown to the point where all the variables no longer exist. In his low and gentle voice, the light of the multicolored stone in his hand finally spread to the distance. The colorful light turned into nothingness the moment it touched the real environment. The energy of nothingness followed the instinct of fusion and finally entered the Qin family's courtyard.